Jon Snow stands in the training yard at Winterfell, with a bastard sword in his hands and a stillness in his body that does not belong to a boy of 14. He moves the way fire moves, quick and certain and impossible to predict. And every man watching knows that something is happening here that Winterfell has not seen before. The question is not whether a bastard can become the greatest swordsman alive. The question is what happens to Westeros when he does. So settle in for the night, let the fire burn low, and let the story carry you. The morning Ned Stark told his son he could not join the Night's Watch was the morning everything changed, though neither of them knew it yet. They stood in Ned's solar, the room warm with firelight despite the summer snow dusting the yard outside. The desk between them was old northern oak, scarred by the decisions of a dozen Starks before Ned, and the maps and letters spread across its surface were the working clutter of a lord preparing to leave his home for the first time in 15 years. Jon had come with his request rehearsed, his arguments arranged in the careful order of a boy who expected to be refused and had prepared for every objection. The Night's Watch needed men. Uncle Benjen served there with honor. A bastard had no future at Winterfell once Ned left for King's Landing, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it where Jon could hear. Ned listened. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his face showing the particular stillness that Jon had spent his whole life trying to read and never quite succeeding. It was a face built for silence, made of sharp bones and honest grey eyes, and the kind of quiet that could mean either compassion or refusal, and Jon had never learned to tell the difference. No, Ned said. Jon had prepared for resistance. He had not prepared for a single word with no argument behind it. Father, you are not going to the wall. Uncle Benjen said, Benjen does not decide this. I do. Ned's voice carried no anger. It carried something heavier, something Jon would spend years trying to name and never quite managing. You will stay at Winterfell. When I go south, Robb will need you here. Robb has Theon. He has Sir Roderick. He has every lord in the north. He does not need his bastard brother standing in the yard reminding everyone that his father once... Enough. The word was quiet and final. You are staying. That is my decision. Why? Ned looked at him. The firelight caught the lines around his eyes, the grey in his hair, the weight of something Jon could not see, and Ned could not speak. For a moment, Jon thought his father was going to tell him something. The air in the room changed the way air changes before a storm, thick with pressure and unspoken things. Ned's mouth opened, and whatever lived behind his eyes pressed forward, and for one instant, the distance between truth and silence narrowed to almost nothing. Then, it widened again. Because I need you here, Ned said. That is enough. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But Ned Stark's word was the final word in Winterfell, and Jon left the solar with his jaw tight and his eyes burning and a fury in his chest that had nowhere to go except down to the training yard, where he picked up a sword and began to hit things. He did not stop. In the days before Ned departed for King's Landing, Jon trained with an intensity that made the household uneasy. He was in the yard before dawn, working through forms with a longsword, then a bastard sword, then a shield and short blade. He sparred with anyone who would stand across from him, and when no one would. He sparred with the training posts until his arms shook and the wood splintered. The cold of the morning did not slow him. The heat of the afternoon, such as summer heat existed in the north, did not slow him either. He trained the way some men drank, as though the repetition itself was the relief, and the ache in his muscles was the only honest feeling his body could produce. Sir Roderick Castle watched from the covered walkway, his white whiskers wet with morning frost, his arms folded across his chest. He had trained boys at Winterfell for 30 years. He had trained Ned and Brandon and Benjen Stark. He had trained Robb and Theon and Jon from the time they could hold wooden swords. He knew what talent looked like, and he knew what obsession looked like, and the boy in the yard was showing both. He is angry, Maester Luwin observed, standing beside the old knight. The maester's chain clinked softly as he shifted his weight, the links of several metals catching the weak morning sun. But anger alone does not explain what I am seeing. What are you seeing? Sir Roderick was quiet for a moment, watching Jon flow through a sequence of cuts and parries that the knight had never taught him. Movements that seemed to arrive from somewhere instinctive rather than learned. The boy shifted from a standard overhead guard into something lateral and low, a combination that should have left him open but did not, because his feet were already carrying him out of the line of any counter before the imagined counter could arrive. Something I cannot teach, Sir Roderick said. Speed I can build. Strength improves with age. Technique is a matter of repetition, but timing, the ability to see a strike before it arrives and be where it is not, that is something a man is born with or born without. I have trained hundreds of boys. I have seen 3 with that gift. The boy has it. Better than Robb? Sir Roderick hesitated. Answering that question honestly was a political act in a castle where the heir's bastard brother was already a source of tension. Robb was good. Robb was better than most boys his age, with the natural athleticism and competitive spirit of a young lord who had been raised to lead men. But the gap between good and what Jon was doing in the yard below was not a gap that effort could close. Different, he said, which was the most diplomatic lie of his career. Ned left for King's Landing on a grey morning, with the royal party stretching south along the King's Road like a golden serpent. Sansa rode beside the Queen's wheelhouse, her face bright with the promise of the south. Arya rode with the household guard, needle hidden in her baggage. Already calculating how to find a water dancing instructor in the capital. Ned rode at the front with King Robert, 2 old friends riding toward a future that only one of them would survive. Jon watched from the walls. He did not go down to the yard. He did not say goodbye to his father in the crowd, because bastards did not stand in the formal line of farewell. And Jon's pride would not let him hover at the edges like something unwanted. Ghost stood beside him on the battlements, a white shadow barely larger than a dog, the direwolf pup's red eyes tracking the golden column as it wound southward through the snow. Ned looked up at the wall as the column began to move. He found Jon's face among the grey stone and the watchers, and he held his son's gaze for 3 heartbeats, and what passed between them was everything Ned could not say, and Jon could not understand. Then the column moved, and Ned was gone, and Jon went back to the yard. Bran fell the same morning. The scream reached Jon mid-swing, a sound that cut through the yard noise and the wind and stopped every heart in Winterfell. By the time he reached the base of the broken tower, Catelyn was already there, cradling her son's shattered body, making sounds that were not words and were not crying and were something more fundamental than either. Bran was alive. Barely. His legs were wrong, bent at angles that no living limb should hold, and his face was the color of old parchment. And the blood pooling beneath him was dark and slow, in the way that suggested the damage was deep. Maester Luwin was running across the yard with his robes bunched in his fists and his chain swinging. Servants were shouting. The world had cracked open in the time it took a boy to fall from a window, and the sound of it was still echoing off the walls. Jon stood at the edge of the crowd and watched, and Catelyn Stark looked up from her son's body and saw him, and her eyes were red and wild and furious, and the look she gave Jon was the look of a woman who was being punished by the gods, and who knew, with the absolute certainty of grief, that the punishment had something to do with the bastard boy standing 10 feet away. "Get out," she said. "Get away from him." Jon left. He went to the godswood, because there was nowhere else, and he sat beneath the heart tree with Ghost pressed against his leg, the white direwolf's red eyes watching the darkness between the trees, and he did not cry because he had decided years ago that bastards could not afford tears. The carved face of the weirwood looked down at him with its frozen weeping, and the warm water of the hot springs murmured beneath the roots, and the godswood held him the way it had always held him, with the indifferent patience of something that had been standing long before the Starks built their walls, and would be standing long after those walls fell. He sat there until the light faded, and the stars came out between the branches, and when he finally rose to return to the castle, his hands were numb, and his legs were stiff, and the decision that would shape the rest of his life had already been made. though he did not yet know how to name it. If he could not leave Winterfell, and he could not belong to Winterfell, he would become something that Winterfell had never seen. He would become the best. The weeks that followed were the worst of Jon's life, and the making of his skill with a sword. Bran lay in bed, broken and unconscious. Catelyn sat beside him, day and night, eating nothing, speaking to no one, her world compressed to the space between her son's bed and the door. Robb governed Winterfell with the uncertain authority of a boy suddenly thrust into a lord's responsibilities, making decisions about grain stores and border disputes and the 1,000 small crises that a castle produced daily. Theon lounged and smirked and offered advice that was usually wrong and occasionally cruel. The household moved around these fixed points like water around stones, everyone adjusting to a new shape that no one had chosen. Jon trained. He trained through breakfast and supper. He trained until the yard torches were lit and the servants came to tell him the gates were closing. He trained on rest days and feast days, and on the morning a raven brought word that Bran had opened his eyes and could not feel his legs. He trained because the yard was the one place in Winterfell where no one looked at him with pity or resentment or the careful blankness of people who did not know what a bastard was supposed to do when the household was falling apart. The incident that made the household truly uneasy happened in the 3rd week after Bran's fall. A man-at-arms named Hallis Mollen, a solid fighter in his 30s who had served the Starks for a decade, agreed to spar with Jon at full speed. The session was routine for the first few minutes, the familiar percussion of training swords against shields, the shuffle of boots on packed earth. Then, Jon shifted. Something in his rhythm changed, a gear engaging that had not been engaged before, and the speed of his combinations doubled. Hallis blocked the first 2 strikes. The third came from an angle that should not have existed, a rising cut that transitioned into a lateral slash without any visible pause between the movements. The training sword caught Hallis across the ribs hard enough to crack the padding beneath his mail, and the big man staggered backward with his breath gone, and his eyes wide with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the boy he was sparring with was operating at a level he could not reach. Hallis sat on the bench afterward, with his hand pressed against his ribs and his face carrying no anger, only a bewildered respect that was almost comical. He is not getting better the way boys get better, Hallis told the other men-at-arms that evening, in the guardroom where they drank ale and discussed the business of the castle. Boys improve in steps. They learn a thing, they practice a thing, they get a bit quicker, a bit stronger. The Snow Boy is not improving in steps, he is improving the way a fire grows. Every day he is something he was not the day before, and the something is always faster, and always stranger, and always correct. The yard became a proving ground for Jon's expanding abilities. Men who had sparred with him on Monday found that Tuesday's Jon was measurably different from Monday's. Not in large ways, but in small ones that accumulated until the compound effect was staggering. A parry that had been adequate on Monday was slightly faster on Tuesday and significantly faster by Friday. A combination that had been good on Monday was refined on Tuesday and devastating by Friday. The progression was not linear. It was exponential, the acceleration of a talent that had found its groove and was running without friction. Robb still sparred with him daily. The sessions had become less competitive and more educational, Robb learning from Jon rather than the reverse. Though neither of them acknowledged the shift aloud. Robb absorbed what he could, and what he absorbed made him better than most knights twice his age, and the gap between them still widened with every session because Jon was not approaching a ceiling. He was building something that did not have one. Ghost grew alongside his master's skill. The white pup became a white wolf, silent and watchful, and he lay at the edge of the training yard each morning, with his red eyes following Jon's movements and his ears tracking sounds that no human ear could catch. The bond between them was wordless and complete, the kind of understanding that exists between creatures who have recognized something essential in each other. Jon did not train Ghost. Ghost did not need training. They simply knew what the other intended, the way 2 halves of the same thought know each other. Sir Roderick adjusted his approach. He stopped treating Jon as a student and began treating him as a project. He brought out techniques he had not taught in years, advanced forms from the south, and the Vale. Combinations that required the kind of speed and spatial awareness that most fighters never developed. Jon absorbed them the way dry ground absorbs water, instantly and completely, and then he began modifying them, adjusting angles and timing in ways that Sir Roderick recognized as innovations rather than mistakes. One morning, working through a sequence of defensive transitions that Sir Roderick had learned from a Vale Knight decades earlier, Jon adjusted the footwork in a way that turned a purely defensive pattern into something that created an attacking angle. The modification was small, a shift of weight from the back foot to the front at a moment when conventional training kept the weight centered. But the effect was profound. The defensive sequence became a trap. An opponent pressing the attack would find himself overextended against a fighter who had turned retreat into advance without any visible transition. Sir Roderick watched the movement 3 times before he understood what Jon had done, and when he understood. The expression on his face was the expression of a craftsman who has just watched an apprentice improve upon the master's own work. He is creating his own style, Sir Roderick told Robb one evening, with the tone of a man reporting something that both impressed and concerned him. I have seen fighters copy. I have seen fighters improve on what they are taught. I have never seen a boy his age invent movements that work. Is he better than me? Robb asked. Sir Roderick looked at his lord's son with the honest affection of a man who had watched this boy grow from a child to something approaching a young man. Yes, he said. Considerably, Robb absorbed this. He was not jealous. Not exactly. Because Robb Stark possessed the rare gift of being genuinely glad when people he loved excelled. But he was aware that a bastard brother who was considerably better with a sword than the heir of Winterfell was a fact that would eventually create complications neither of them could predict. Good, Robb said. We may need him. Summer burned into autumn. Ravens came from the south carrying news that grew steadily worse. The hand of the king had been injured in a fight with Jaime Lannister's men in the streets of King's Landing. Ned had dismissed the king's planned tournament. Tensions between the Starks and Lannisters were escalating in ways that the careful language of the letters could not entirely conceal, and each raven brought a sense of approaching trouble that was felt throughout the household, from the kitchens to the battlements. Jon read the letters when Robb shared them, which was not always, and he watched the politics of the South with the detached attention of someone who knew those games were not meant for him. His world was the yard. His ambition was the sword. Whatever was happening in King's Landing was Ned's problem, and Robb's inheritance, and none of Jon Snow's business. He was wrong about that, but he would not understand how wrong for several months yet. A sellsword came through Winterfell in the last weeks of autumn, a Braavosi named Cyril, who had fought in the disputed lands and the tawny circuits of the free cities, and who carried 2 swords and a reputation for teaching wealthy lords' sons how to fight in the Eastern style. Robb hired him for a fortnight, thinking the man could provide Jon and himself with techniques Sir Roderick could not. Cyril was lean and quiet, and moved with the controlled economy of a man who had spent 20 years learning to waste nothing. Not a gesture, not a step, not a breath. He wore his swords crossed on his back in the Braavosi fashion, and spoke with the clipped precision of someone for whom the common tongue was a functional tool rather than a native language. He sparred with Jon on the second morning, a session that was supposed to last an hour and ended after 15 minutes. Cyril came at Jon with the water dancing style, fluid and quick, probing with feints that were designed to draw a reaction before the attack arrived. Jon did not react to the feints. He read them, catalogued them, and waited for the real strike with the patience of a spider in a web. Cyril circled left, then right, testing Jon's tracking with the systematic patience of a man who had mapped 1,000 opponents. He threw a high-line feint that most fighters would have read as an attack on the face and responded to by raising their guard. Jon's guard did not move. His eyes followed the blade with a detachment that Cyril found unsettling, because it meant the boy was reading intent rather than action, watching where the body wanted to go rather than where the sword appeared to be going. Cyril changed tactics. He came in low, genuinely low, a water-dancing thrust aimed at Jon's leading knee that required a specific defensive response, a drop parry and lateral step that would create distance and reset the exchange. Jon did not use the specific defensive response. He lifted his front foot entirely, letting the thrust pass beneath it, and brought his own blade down in an arc that used the momentum of his rising knee to generate power. The movement was absurd. It should not have worked. A man standing on one foot in the middle of a sword fight was a man who had abandoned the first principle of combat, which was balance. But Jon's balance was not in his feet. It was in his center, in the core of his body, in a gyroscopic stability that kept him oriented in space, regardless of what his limbs were doing. The edge of Jon's training sword stopped a finger's width from Cyril's wrist. A touch there would have opened the tendons. A real blade would have ended the Bravosi's career. Cyril tried 3 more exchanges after that, each one using a different combination from his extensive repertoire, techniques drawn from Braavos and Luz and the fighting pits of Astapor. Jon answered each one with something novel, something that existed in no training manual from any culture. Responses that were invented in the moment and executed with a precision that made them look rehearsed. When the real strike came, Jon met it with a movement that was neither water dancing nor Westerosi swordsmanship, but something that existed in the space between the two. A response that used the Bravosi's own momentum to create an opening that ended with Cyril's blade pinned against the ground and Jon's point resting lightly against the sellsword's chest. Cyril stepped back, lowered his sword, and looked at Jon with the particular expression of a professional whose assumptions have just been dismantled. He lasted 3 days before he told Robb he was wasting his money. "The other one," Cyril said, meaning Jon. "He does not need a teacher. He needs opponents. Better opponents than this castle can provide. How good is he?" Cyril considered the question with the professional detachment of a man who had seen fighters from Braavos to Volantis and who measured skill the way a jeweler measured gemstones. He did not answer immediately. He looked out at the yard where Jon was working through forms in the grey afternoon light, the bastard sword tracing patterns that were becoming entirely his own. "I have fought in the pits of Meereen and the water gardens of Braavos and the tourney fields of Pentos. I have seen perhaps 4 fighters in my life who moved the way your brother moves. 2 of them are dead. One is the first sword of Braavos." He paused. "The boy is 17. In 5 years, I do not think there will be anyone in the known world who can beat him." Robb paid the man and sent him on his way and did not share this assessment with Jon, because Jon did not need encouragement to train harder, and because telling a bastard boy that he might become the greatest swordsman alive was the kind of information that could create as many problems as it solved. The raven that changed everything arrived on a cold evening when the first true winter winds were pushing south from the wall. Ned Stark had been arrested, accused of treason, imprisoned in the black cells of the Red Keep by order of King Joffrey, who was not Robert's son and had no right to the throne, and who had taken it anyway, because the Lannisters held the swords and the gold and the walls. The details arrived in fragments over the following days, carried by riders and ravens and rumour, and each fragment made the picture worse. Robert was dead. Ned had tried to expose the Queen's children as illegitimate. The Lannisters had responded with the swift brutality that was their particular talent, and the Lord of Winterfell was now a prisoner in his own king's dungeon. Robb read the first letter aloud in the great hall, his voice steady in the way of a young man who was holding himself together through sheer will. The northern lords who had come for the harvest feast sat in their chairs and absorbed the news, and the room filled with the low, dangerous rumble of men whose lord had been taken. The great Jon Umber, massive and fierce, slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the plates. Lord Karstark sat in rigid silence, his sons flanking him like pillars. Magie Mormont from Bear Island wore an expression that suggested she would prefer to be killing someone rather than sitting in a hall listening to letters. Jon stood at the back of the hall. Bastards did not sit at the high table during formal councils. He listened to the words and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that the world had just changed in a way that would reach him no matter how far from the politics he tried to stand. Robb looked across the hall and found Jon's eyes, and what passed between the brothers was not a question. It was an answer. "Call the banners," Robb said. The argument with Catelyn happened the following morning, She had emerged from Bran's room for the first time in weeks, gaunt and fierce, her grief temporarily displaced by a fury that gave her something to do besides watch her son not walk. She stood in the Lord's Solar with Robb and Maester Lewin and Sir Roderick, and she laid out the situation with the precise intelligence that had always been her greatest asset and her most dangerous weapon. You must march south. You must demand your father's release. You must bring the Northern Army to the Riverlands, where my father's lands are being burned by Tywin Lannister's raiders. And you must do all of this without making a mistake that gets Ned killed. I know, Robb said. Who commands the vanguard? Great Jon Umber. And Jon. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes an explosion. No, Catelyn said. Mother. He is not a Stark. He has no place commanding northern soldiers in a war that will determine the future of this house. He is the best fighter in Winterfell. Sir Roderick will tell you. Cyril the Bravosi will tell you. Every man who has stood across from him in the yard for the past 6 months will tell you. I need him. You need lords. You need allegiances. You need political strength. You do not need a bastard boy with a sword, however talented. His presence in your command will offend the lords who follow you, and every success he earns will raise questions about why a bastard is doing what true-born men should be doing. Robb looked at his mother. He loved her. He respected her intelligence, and he was going to overrule her. Jon rides with me, Robb said. That is my decision. Catelyn's jaw tightened. She looked at her son with an expression that mixed pride in his authority with fear of what that authority would cost, and she left the room without another word. Jon found out about the argument from Theon, who told him with the cheerful cruelty that was Theon's particular specialty. Your brother wants you. His mother doesn't. The usual arrangement. Theon smiled. Try not to die in a way that proves her right. Jon said nothing. He went to the yard and trained until his arms burned, and then he packed his things and sharpened his sword and waited. The march south began in the first true cold of winter. 20,000 Northmen strung out along the road in a column that took a day to pass. Stark banners and Karstark banners and Umber banners and the mailed fists of the Glovers and the Bear of Mormont, all moving toward a war that none of them had wanted and all of them intended to win. The column made a sound like a river. The continuous rumble of hooves and boots and wagon wheels on frozen ground, and the sound carried for miles through the winter air, announcing to every farm and village along the road that the North was marching. Jon rode near the front, beside Robb, with Ghost padding silently alongside his horse. The white direwolf was enormous now, the size of a small pony, his red eyes scanning the landscape with the patience of a predator who had not yet found anything worth killing. Greywind ranged ahead of Robb's horse, and the two wolves together made the column's vanguard something that scouts reported and commanders worried about. The first days of the march were education. Jon had trained for war in the yard at Winterfell, where the ground was familiar and the walls were close, and the worst consequence of a mistake was bruised ribs. Marching was different. The rhythm of it was different. The endless forward movement that compressed hours into distance and reduced the complex business of living to the simple acts of riding and eating and sleeping and riding again. His body adapted quickly, the horseback hours building calluses where his thighs gripped the saddle and his hands gripped the reins. The constant alertness of a soldier on the move, sharpening his already sharp instincts into something that operated continuously rather than in the bursts of a sparring session. He trained in the evenings when the column halted. While the soldiers pitched tents and built fires and cooked the provisions that the quartermasters distributed, Jon found an open space and worked through forms in the fading light. The men who watched him no longer found it strange. It was simply what the bastard did. The way breathing was what a man did, continuous and essential and unremarkable to the man himself. Some evenings, other soldiers joined him. Young men from the Karstark levies and the Umberfoot and the Glover archers, drawn by the quiet fame that had followed Jon from Winterfell, wanting to learn what the bastard knew. Jon taught them what he could, which was technique and positioning, and the fundamental principle that a fight was decided before the first blow landed. By where you stood, and how you stood, and what you saw. What he could not teach them was the thing that made him different from them. The preternatural speed and spatial awareness that could not be learned because it was not a skill, but a capacity, like perfect pitch, or the ability to see in dim light. The landscape changed as they moved south, and the change itself taught Jon something about war that the Yard could not. War was geography. The rivers they crossed, the hills they skirted, the forests they passed through were not scenery, but terrain, each feature presenting tactical possibilities that a mind trained to see angles could read the way a maester read text. Jon began to see the land as a swordsman sees an opponent, full of openings and defenses and the potential for movement that could turn advantage into victory. They passed through lands that grew softer and greener as they moved south, the snow thinning to frost and the frost giving way to mud, and the mud eventually becoming the churned, rain-soaked earth of the riverlands, where the war had already begun without them. Burned farmhouses stood like blackened teeth against the grey sky. Fields that should have been harvested lay trampled and ruined. The Lannister raiders had come through like a plague, systematic and thorough, and the destruction they left behind was the destruction of people who wanted the land broken rather than conquered. The army reached the Twins in the second week. Walder Frey's castle straddled the Green Fork like a toll booth built by a man whose primary talent was extracting payment from people who had no choice but to pass. The old lord demanded his price. A marriage for Robb, a marriage for Arya, wards and honors, and the grasping, greedy arithmetic of a man who had spent 90 years turning other people's necessity into his own advantage. Robb paid. He agreed to the terms because the crossing was essential, and because a promise made to win a war could be dealt with after the war was won. The calculation was practical, and it was a mistake, and the consequences would arrive later with the patient inevitability of a debt collector who never forgets. The war council that followed the crossing was held in a tent that smelled of wet wool and horse leather, and it determined the shape of everything that came after. 2 Lannister armies, Robb said, studying the map. Jaime at Riverrun with 15,000. Tywin marching east with 30,000. If they combine, we are finished. Split them, Jon said, from his place at the edge of the table. He had not been formally invited to the council, but Robb had asked him to attend, and no one had objected loudly enough to matter. Robb looked at him. The other lords looked at him too, and their expressions ranged from curiosity to barely concealed irritation at a bastard speaking in a council of lords. The Gratjon takes 2,000 down the Green Fork, Jon continued. Slowly, visibly, Tywin sees a northern army approaching and assumes it is the main force. He engages. Meanwhile, we take the rest of the cavalry through the Whispering Wood and hit Jaime's siege camp before he knows we are there. That is precisely what I was considering, Robb said, and the look he gave Jon contained both gratitude and a gentle warning that the idea needed to appear to be Robb's rather than his bastard brother's. Jon understood. He stepped back from the table and said nothing more, and when Robb presented the plan to the assembled lords as his own, Jon watched from the shadows and did not mind, because bastards learned early that credit was a luxury they could not afford. The Battle of the Whispering Wood was fought at dawn, and it was the morning Jon Snow stopped being a talented boy with a sword and became something else entirely. The cavalry came through the forest in silence, 6,000 riders moving through ancient oaks and tall sentinels, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp forest floor. The mist hung between the trunks in grey curtains, and the only sound was the creak of leather and the soft jingle of mail, and the stillness of 6,000 men trying not to breathe too loudly was a kind of tension that pressed against the inside of the skull. Grey Wind and Ghost ranged ahead, 2 wolves in the fog, one grey and one white. And the soldiers who followed them did so with the particular courage of men who were riding behind predators that seemed to know where the enemy was before any scout could report it. Jaime Lannister's camp was spread along the western bank of the Tumblestone, oriented toward Riverrun's walls. His sentries faced east, toward the castle he was besieging. His western flank was the forest, which Jaime had judged too dense for a cavalry approach, because Jaime Lannister had spent his military career fighting in the open country of the Westerlands, where battles were decided on clear ground between armored men. Robb did not fight on clear ground. The charge burst from the tree line at first light. 6,000 horses hitting level ground after hours of careful forest movement. The sound of it a rolling thunder that reached every corner of the camp at the same instant. The siege lines collapsed. Men who had been sleeping were suddenly dying. Men who had been cooking were suddenly fighting. The organized structure of a military camp dissolved into the savage chaos of a surprise attack. And in that chaos, Jaime Lannister did what Jaime Lannister always did. He fought. The Kingslayer rallied his personal guard and cut a path toward the Stark banners with the ferocious brilliance that had made him the most feared swordsman in Westeros. His golden armor caught the dawn light as he moved, and the sword in his hand seemed to know where every throat was before his eyes found it. 3 northern soldiers fell. Then 5. Then 7. Jaime Lannister was fighting his way toward Robb Stark with the single-minded fury of a man who believed that killing the enemy commander would end the battle. Because for Jaime, war had always been personal. Jon saw him. He was 40 yards from Robb's position, fighting a Lannister sergeant who was already overmatched and did not know it yet, when the golden figure cutting through the northern lines registered in his peripheral vision. Jon finished the sergeant with a strike that Sir Roderick had never taught him. A low feint that drew the man's guard down and opened a line to the neck that ended the fight in a single motion. Then he turned his horse toward the golden armor and spurred forward. They met in the churned mud between the collapsed siege lines and the riverbank. Jaime saw him coming. The Kingslayer's eyes found Jon through the chaos of the battle, and what he saw was a dark-haired boy on a dark horse with a white wolf running at his flank. And the expression on Jaime's face was the expression of a man who did not know this opponent and did not consider him worth knowing. That expression lasted approximately 4 seconds. Jon's first strike came from an angle that Jaime did not expect. A descending cut that began as an overhead blow and shifted mid-swing into a lateral slash that would have opened Jaime's throat if the Kingslayer had not adjusted with the reflexive speed of a man who had been fighting since before Jon was born. Jaime's parry was perfect, a textbook deflection that redirected Jon's blade and created the opening for a counterstroke that should have ended the fight. Jon was not there. He had moved, not backward, which was what a competent fighter would do after a blocked strike, sideways and forward into Jaime's reach rather than away from it, closing the distance to a range where the Kingslayer's longer arms became a disadvantage rather than an asset. Jon's second strike came from below, a rising cut aimed at the gap between Jaime's breastplate and his arm, and Jaime barely caught it on his crossguard, the impact jarring through both their arms. Jaime's eyes changed. The casual dismissal was gone. What replaced it was the focused, calculating attention of the best swordsman in Westeros, recognizing that he was fighting someone who might be his equal. They fought in the mud of the Tumblestone while the battle raged around them. Jaime struck with the precise, devastating technique of a man trained by the finest masters in the 7 kingdoms, every blow placed with surgical intent. Every combination designed to create openings that should have been fatal. Jon fought with something different. His movements were faster than they should have been, and they came from directions that formal training did not predict, and the combinations he used were combinations that no master had taught because no master had invented them. He fought with the style he had built in the yard at Winterfell, the style that Sir Roderick could not teach and Syrell could not match, and the Kingslayer had never encountered anything like it. Jaime was better technically. His footwork was superior, his blade control more refined, his understanding of distance and timing built on 20 years of combat experience. Against any other fighter in Westeros, that superiority would have been decisive. Jon was faster. Not slightly faster, the marginal advantage that separates good fighters from excellent ones. Fundamentally faster, in the way that a hawk is faster than a crow, the kind of speed that seems to bend the rules of what a human body should be able to do. His reactions operated ahead of conscious thought. He saw Jaime's strikes before they fully formed. Read the micro-movements of shoulder and hit that telegraph direction, and arrived at the interception point before the blow reached its target. The 7th exchange nearly killed Jon. Jaime feinted high, and came in low with a rising thrust that was invisible until it was almost in Jon's ribs. A deceptive strike that used the Kingslayer's superior reach to attack from a distance that should have been safe. Jon twisted away from the point and felt the blade open a line across his side, not deep enough to disable, but deep enough to draw blood and remind him that the man he was fighting had been killing people since before Jon could walk. The wound burned, and Jon used the burn, letting the pain sharpen his focus the way a whetstone sharpened steel. The 9th exchange was the one the soldiers remembered best. Jaime launched a sequence of 3 overhead cuts, each one aimed at a different part of Jon's body. High right then, high left then center, a combination designed to force the defender into a predictable pattern of parries that would create the opening for a killing thrust on the 4th beat. Jon parried the first 2 and stepped inside the 3rd, so close to Jaime that their hilts nearly locked, and the expression on the Kingslayer's face as Jon's blade whispered past his ear was the expression of a man who had just discovered that the rules he had fought by his entire life did not apply to the opponent in front of him. They separated. Circled, Jaime's breathing was harder now, the exertion showing in the set of his shoulders and the sweat cutting channels through the mud and blood on his face. Jon's breathing was controlled, the deep, rhythmic pattern of a fighter who had trained his body to operate beyond the point where other men's bodies failed. The difference was not physical. It was structural. Jaime fought with the accumulated habits of 20 years of conventional excellence. Jon fought with something that had no precedent and therefore no habits, each movement invented fresh, each response calibrated to the specific moment rather than drawn from a catalogue of practiced responses. 12 exchanges. 14. The fight lasted less than a minute by any reasonable count. But it felt like hours, and the men who watched it from the edges of the battle would describe it for the rest of their lives. Jaime overextended. It was a small thing. A half-inch of extra reach on a lateral cut aimed at Jon's ribs, the kind of error that a lesser opponent would never have punished. Hon caught the blade on his own, redirected the force, and drove his shoulder into Jaime's chest. The Kingslayer staggered. His back foot hit a body lying in the mud, and for one instant, his balance failed. Jon's sword was at Jaime's throat before the Golden Knight could recover. "Yield," Jon said. Jaime Lannister looked at the blade pressed against his neck. He looked at the boy holding it. He looked at the White Wolf standing 6 feet away, red eyes fixed on him with the patient attention of an animal waiting for permission to kill. The silence between them was filled with the sounds of a battle that was already ending. Around them, the Lannister camp was collapsing. The siege was broken. Robb's cavalry was sweeping through the remnants with the momentum of total surprise. Jaime's sword was still in his hand. He could have tried. He was Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the finest blade of his generation, and the fury of being beaten by an unknown boy in a muddy field was hot enough to make him consider dying rather than kneeling. He looked at Jon's eyes. Dark eyes, steady, calm, showing none of the triumph that should have been there. Just patience. The kind of patience that said this boy would wait exactly as long as necessary and act the instant the waiting ended. "Who are you?" Jaime asked. "Jon Snow." "The bastard." Something flickered across Jaime's face. Not recognition, not exactly. Something else. The sense that he was looking at a puzzle he could not solve. "You fight like someone I knew. I cannot place it." "Yield," Jon said again. Jaime Lannister dropped his sword in the mud. The golden blade, the weapon of the most famous swordsman in Westeros, landed in the churned earth of the tumblestone bank and lay there catching the morning light. "I yield," Jaime said, "to a bastard in a field. My father will be thrilled." Robb reached them moments later, grey wind at his side, the young lord's face flushed with victory and something very close to shock. "You beat Jaime Lannister," Robb said. Jon looked at his brother. The adrenaline was leaving his body, and what replaced it was not elation, but a strange hollow clarity. The understanding that something had just happened that could not be taken back, and whose consequences he could not yet see. "He slipped," Jon said. "He did not slip." Robb looked at the Kingslayer kneeling in the mud, then back at Jon. "You beat the best swordsman in Westeros." "One of us had to." Robb laughed. It was the laugh of a boy who was too young to be fighting a war and too proud of his brother to contain it, and the sound of it carried across the wrecked camp and made men look up from the business of binding prisoners and counting dead. The news spread faster than the army could march. Before the Whispering Woods dead were fully counted, the story of the bastard of Winterfell, who had defeated the Kingslayer in single combat, was traveling by raven and rider and whispered conversation to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. In the Lannister camp, the tale was a humiliation. Jaime Lannister, the Golden Lion, the Sword of the West, beaten by a bastard boy no one had heard of. Tywin Lannister received the news at his headquarters near the crossroads and processed it with the cold precision that characterized everything he did. His son captured. His Western army broken. And a new name to consider, Jon Snow, a name that Tywin filed away in the part of his mind where he stored threats that required eventual attention. In the northern camp, the tale was a miracle. The soldiers spoke Jon's name with the reverent enthusiasm of men who had witnessed something they could not entirely believe. The bastard who beat the Kingslayer. The bastard with the white wolf. The bastard whose sword moved faster than sight. Songs appeared within days, the rough, cheerful compositions of soldiers who needed their victories to have heroes, and the hero they chose was not the king who had planned the battle, but the bastard who had won the duel. They called him the Wolf's Fang before the battle's dead were counted. The name appeared the way battlefield names always appeared, coined by a soldier whose identity was lost in the telling and adopted by hundreds of others who found in it a compression of everything they had witnessed. The Wolf's Fang, because Jon's sword had been the tooth in the jaws of Robb's attack, the point of the wolf's bite. The name spread from campfire to campfire, carried by wounded men and celebrating men and the women who followed the army and who heard the stories and repeated them with the particular embellishment that turns events into legends. A song appeared by the second evening, a rough marching tune composed by an umber soldier who could barely carry a melody but whose enthusiasm compensated for his skill. The bastard rode to battle with a white wolf at his side. The song went, and the Golden Lion knelt, and the silver towers fell. It was not good poetry. It was not meant to be. It was the sound of soldiers processing an extraordinary event through the only medium available to them, and the sound traveled through the northern army like weather. Jon felt the attention settle on him like a weight he had not asked to carry. He was not comfortable with it. Glory was something he had never sought, because bastards learned early that prominence was dangerous. That being noticed meant being measured against the true-born children who would always have more right to exist. The fame was a garment that did not fit, tailored for a man with a name and a house and a future, and Jon Snow had none of those things. He trained. When the celebrations filled the camp with songs and wine and the particular raucousness of soldiers who had survived a victory, Jon went to the edge of the camp and worked through forms in the moonlight, ghost watching from the shadows, and the only sound was the whisper of steel through cold air. Catelyn found him there. She had ridden south from Winterfell to meet Robb's army, arriving at the camp 2 days after the battle, and the first face she had been told about was not Robb's, it was Jon's. Every soldier she passed had a version of the story. The bastard, the Kingslayer, the White Wolf. By the time she reached Robb's tent, the name Jon Snow had been spoken to her more times than her own sons. She stood at the edge of the firelight and watched him move. The sword caught the moonlight in long silver arcs, and the boy moved with a grace that was almost painful to watch, beautiful and wrong, because this talent belonged to a bastard, and a bastard's talent was a threat that no mother could ignore. "You should be celebrating with the others," she said. Jon stopped. He turned and found her in the darkness, and his face showed the careful blankness he always wore around Catelyn Stark, the expression of a boy who had learned to make himself invisible in the presence of the woman who wished he did not exist. "My lady, you fought well. The men speak of nothing else. The men are generous. The men are not wrong. Catelyn's voice was precise and cold. "You defeated Jaime Lannister. That is remarkable." "I am not too proud to acknowledge remarkable." Jon waited. He knew her well enough to know that acknowledgement was the prelude to something else. "But you should understand what you have done," Catelyn continued. "You have made yourself famous. A bastard whose name is on every tongue in the camp. A bastard whose sword is more celebrated than the king's. Do you understand the danger in that? I understand that your son needed someone to stop Jaime Lannister from reaching him. And I stopped him. You did. And in doing so, you became the story. Not Robb. Not the king in the north. Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell." Her eyes were hard and bright in the firelight. "Fame is a currency, Jon, and a bastard with too much currency is a threat to every true-born child who holds less. I am no threat to Robb. Not intentionally. But intent does not govern what men believe. They already whisper that Ned Stark's bastard is worth more with a sword than Ned Stark's heir. How long before they whisper that a man worth more with a sword should be worth more in other ways?" Jon looked at her. The hurt was there, underneath the blankness, the old familiar wound of being told that his existence was a problem. "I will not compete with Robb," Jon said. "Not for Winterfell. Not for the North. Not for anything. I believe you. I do not believe the world." Catelyn turned and walked back toward the camp. At the edge of the light, she paused. "Be careful, Jon Snow. The better you become, the more dangerous your life will be. Not because of your enemies, because of your name." She left. Jon stood in the moonlight with his sword in his hand and Ghost at his side, and the silence was not comfortable, and the future was not clear, and the weight of being excellent at something the world would not let him own settled on his shoulders like a cloak he could not remove. The war continued, and Jon's reputation grew with every engagement. At the fords of the Red Fork, where Tywin Lannister's army probed the river crossings and withdrew when the northern defense held, Jon commanded the reserve with a competence that surprised the lords, who had expected a bastard to be useful only as a blade rather than a mind. He positioned his men to cover the secondary crossings, anticipated Tywin's flanking attempts, and held the southern ford against a Lannister force 3 times his number through a combination of terrain advantage and the practical reality that soldiers who had watched Jon Snow fight were soldiers who believed they could not lose. The fighting at the fords lasted 3 days. The Lannisters came in waves, testing first the northern crossing, then the southern, then attempting both simultaneously with a coordination that spoke to the experience of commanders who had fought campaigns across the Westerlands and the Reach. Jon read each attempt the way he read a sword fight, watching for the feint that preceded the real attack, and his positioning was so consistently correct that the Lannister commanders began to suspect he was receiving intelligence from scouts they could not find. He was not. He was watching the water. The Lannisters forded at the southern crossing because the current was weakest there. And the current was weakest there because the river bent slightly to the east, which meant the attacking force had to approach at an angle that exposed their left flank to Jon's archers. He saw the vulnerability the way he saw vulnerabilities in a sword fight, as geometry rather than guesswork, and his response was equally precise. The first assault on the southern ford came at dawn on the second day. A column of Lannister infantry, 300 strong, waded into the shallows with their shields raised against the arrow volleys that Jon's archers delivered from the eastern bank. The water was waist deep, and the current dragged at the soldiers' legs, and the combination of water resistance and incoming arrows turned the crossing into a slow, grinding ordeal that cost the Lannisters a dozen men before the first soldier reached the far bank. Jon met the first wave with his reserve infantry, waiting until the Lannister soldiers had crossed the deepest channel and were struggling up the muddy bank before committing his men. The timing was deliberate. Men emerging from a river crossing were men at their most vulnerable, exhausted from the water, their shields waterlogged and heavy, their footing uncertain on the slick bank. Jon's infantry hit them at the waterline and drove them back into the shallows, and the retreat through waist-deep water under pressure was a chaos of drowning men and abandoned shields, and the grey water of the Red Fork turning pink. Jon fought in the line himself at the southern ford. The sword work was different from the yard, different from the controlled exchanges of sparring. It was ugly, compressed, fought at ranges where technique mattered less than ferocity, and where the man who struck first survived, and the man who hesitated did not. Jon discovered that his speed advantage was even more decisive in this kind of fighting, because the close quarters eliminated the distance advantage that taller, stronger opponents usually held. And the chaos eliminated the structured exchanges where experience and technique could compensate for slower reflexes. He was a predator in a space designed for predators, and the Lannister soldiers who faced him at the waterline learned what the yard at Winterfell had already taught every sparring partner Jon had ever had, which was that fighting Jon Snow was an experience with a very limited number of positive outcomes. On the third day, Tywin withdrew, not because the fords were unbreakable, but because the cost of breaking them exceeded the strategic value. And Tywin Lannister did not spend soldiers the way lesser commanders did, as currency to be thrown at problems until the problems collapsed. He retreated south, reorganizing his forces for a campaign that would be measured in months rather than days. The Northern Lords began to adjust their opinion. The Great Jon, who had initially dismissed Jon as a boy who should carry Robb's sword rather than swing his own, took Jon aside after the ford defense and told him, with the blunt warmth that was the Umber way, that he was the best fighter the North had produced since the Young Wolf, meaning Robb's great-uncle who had died in the War of the Nimpenny Kings. "Don't let it make you stupid," the Great Jon said. "Talent kills more men than cowardice, because cowards run and talented men stand and fight when they should be running too." Lord Karstark, whose sons fought beside Jon at the fords, was more measured in his praise and more direct in his concern. "The boy is extraordinary, which makes him either the greatest asset your son possesses or the greatest threat to your son's legacy," he told Catelyn. And Catelyn looked at him with the expression of a woman who had already identified the problem and did not appreciate being reminded of it. Robb, for his part, showed no jealousy. Whatever rivalry existed between the brothers was buried so deep beneath genuine affection that it surfaced only in small moments. A tightening around Robb's jaw when soldiers cheered Jon's name, a brief silence when bannermen compared the bastard's swordwork to the king's, a careful effort to ensure that his own command decisions were recognized alongside Jon's combat achievements. These were the signs of a man who was secure enough in himself to tolerate his brother's brilliance, but honest enough to notice when that brilliance cast a shadow. "You know they call you the Wolf's Fang," Robb told Jon one evening, sitting in his command tent with maps and candles and the quiet that came after a day of planning. "I know. Not the bastard's blade or Snow's sword. The Wolf's Fang. As if you are an extension of me, rather than a person in your own right. I am your brother. Being an extension of you is not an insult. It is not meant to be. But it is also not true." Robb looked at him with an expression that was older than his years. "You are your own man, Jon. You have been since the yard at Winterfell. I cannot keep pretending otherwise, and neither can the Lords." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I need to find you a place. A real place, not the shadow behind the king, but something with a name and a title and enough authority to match what you have already earned. I am a bastard, Robb. Bastards do not hold titles. Kings can change that." The words hung between them. Jon understood what Robb was offering, and the enormity of it pressed against the walls of a room that suddenly felt too small. "You would legitimize me. I would make you Jon Stark, Lord of something, I have not decided what yet, but a Stark with lands and a name and the right to build something that lasts." Jon was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Ghost lay beside the tent flap, his white fur glowing in the candlelight, his red eyes open and watching, always watching. "Your mother would never accept it. My mother's acceptance is not required. I am the king. And when you have sons, an uncle named Stark with the best sword in Westeros and the loyalty of half the army is not a comfortable presence for a young heir." Robb's expression flickered. The political calculation Jon had just laid out was exactly the calculation Catelyn had been making since the Whispering Wood. And hearing it from Jon's own mouth, knowing that Jon understood the threat he represented and was choosing to protect Robb's future children over his own advancement, produced something in Robb that was too complex for either of them to name. "We will discuss it after the war," Robb said. After the war, Jon agreed. Neither of them knew how little time remained before that discussion became impossible. The ravens from Winterfell arrived on a morning when fog lay thick on the river and the camp was quiet, with the particular stillness of men who had been at war long enough to find routine in violence. Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell. Robb read the letter twice, as if the second reading might change the words. Theon, the boy who had grown up in their household, who had eaten at their table and trained in their yard, and called himself Robb's closest friend, had sailed to the Iron Islands, raised his father's banners, and captured the castle that had sheltered him for 10 years. He had taken it with a handful of Ironborn and a talent for cruelty that no one at Winterfell had suspected, scaling the walls in the night while the garrison slept and holding a blade to the throat of every person who had ever shown him kindness. Bran and Rickon were prisoners. The household was under Ironborn occupation, and the man who had done it was someone they had trusted. Jon took the news in silence. He stood in Robb's tent with his hands at his sides and his face showing nothing, and the stillness in his body was the stillness of a man who was containing something that would be very dangerous if he let it out. Ghost, lying at his feet, pressed his muzzle against Jon's boot and made a sound that was almost too quiet to hear. A low whine that was the wolf's version of the fury his master would not express. "I should have been there," Jon said. "You were here, where I needed you. You needed me in a war. Your brothers needed me at home. I made the wrong choice. I made the choice, not you." Robb's voice was ragged. "I brought you south. I left Winterfell with a skeleton garrison because I needed every man for the war. And Theon, the man I left in the north because I trusted him, is the one who..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I will hang him. When this is over, I will hang him from the walls of Winterfell and let the crows have him. We need to retake the castle. We need to win the war first. If I march north, Tywin strikes the Riverlands. If I split the army, both halves are too weak to hold." Robb pressed his palms against the map table. "Everything I do creates a problem I cannot solve." Jon looked at the map. The Riverlands stretched between them and home, and the armies that moved across it were pieces in a game that was becoming too complicated for any single mind to play. "Send Bolton," Jon said. "Roose Bolton and his men. They march north, retake Winterfell, and hold the north while we finish the southern campaign." Robb considered this. Roose Bolton was capable, cold, effective, and entirely untrustworthy in the specific way that made him the right choice for a task that required brutality and the wrong choice for a task that required loyalty. His pale eyes gave away nothing. His voice never rose above a whisper. He was the kind of man who made other men uneasy without doing anything that could be named as a cause for unease. "Bolton," Robb repeated. "You trust him?" "I trust him to want the task. A man who wants what you are offering will do it well, at least until the bill comes due." Robb gave the order. Bolton marched north with 2,000 men, and the decision solved one problem and planted the seed of a betrayal that would bloom in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. The war ground on through the winter months. The Northern Army won battles and lost territory. Every victory produced a consequence that made the next victory harder. Tywin's forces were pushed back to the Westerlands, but could not be destroyed. The Riverlands were liberated, but could not be held without more men than Robb could spare. Stannis and Renly fought their own war in the south, splitting the Baratheon forces and preventing either from becoming the ally Robb needed. Jon fought in every engagement. His reputation preceded him into battle now, and the psychological effect was as valuable as his swordsmanship. Lannister soldiers who saw the White Wolf or heard the name Jon Snow hesitated in ways that created openings their commanders could not close. The bastard of Winterfell had become a weapon in his own right, and the weapon grew sharper with every fight. He was wounded twice. A lance grazed his ribs at the Battle of Oxcross, leaving a scar that pulled when he raised his left arm above his shoulder. A sword cut opened his thigh at a skirmish near Ashermark, deep enough to require stitching and painful enough to keep him from the saddle for 3 days. He healed both times, and returned to the line both times, and the injuries only added to the legend. Because a fighter who bled and recovered and came back stronger was a fighter who seemed impossible to stop. The lords began to say it openly now. The greatest swordsman in Westeros. Not the greatest bastard fighter, not the best blade for a Snow, but the greatest. The comparison to Jaime Lannister was redundant because Jon had already beaten Jaime. The comparison to the legendary fighters of previous generations, to Arthur Dayne and Barristan Selmy and Aemon the Dragon Knight, was the comparison that travelled through the camps and the taverns and the courts of every lord who heard the stories. It was the kind of reputation that preceded a man through doors and around corners, arriving before he did and shaping every interaction before he could speak a word. Jon did not enjoy the title. He did not reject it either. What he felt, in the quiet moments when the fighting stopped and the praise receded and Ghost lay beside him in the dark, was the particular emptiness of a man who had achieved everything he could achieve with a sword and discovered that it filled nothing. He was the greatest swordsman in Westeros. He was also a bastard with no home, no name, no lands, no future. The sword had given him fame and respect and the loyalty of soldiers who would die for him. It had not given him the thing he actually wanted, which was to belong somewhere, to someone, as something more than a weapon. Robb married Talisa Maega in the first month of winter, and the consequences arrived before the marriage bed was cold. Jon had tried to counsel against it, not loudly, not publicly, because a bastard did not lecture a king about his marriage choices, but in the quiet of Robb's tent, with the flap closed and the guards posted, and the conversation protected by the privacy that brothers could still share even when one wore a crown. "You swore to marry a Frey," Jon said. "I know. Walder Frey does not forget. He does not forgive. And he does not take broken promises as the cost of doing business. I know that too." "Then what are you doing?" Robb looked at him. The young king's face held the particular expression of a man who understood exactly what he was risking and had decided to risk it anyway, because the alternative was a life spent performing duty without ever feeling alive. "I love her," Robb said. "I know you do." "That is not the question." "What is the question?" "The question is whether your love is worth the alliance. Because the Freys will not simply be offended. They will be looking for the first opportunity to make you pay, and the payment will be extracted at a time and place of their choosing, not yours." "I have you," Robb said. "I have the Wolf's Fang, and 30,000 men, and the finest swordsman alive. Walder Frey can sulk in his towers. He will not move against me while I hold the field." Jon heard the overconfidence in those words and recognized it for what it was, the dangerous belief that military strength could substitute for political prudence. He had helped create that belief. Every battle he won, every opponent he defeated, every time his sword solved a problem that politics should have solved, he reinforced Robb's conviction that the North was too strong to need the Freys. The sword in Jon's hand had become a crutch in Robb's mind, and the crutch was about to be tested against a danger that no blade could parry. "You are making a mistake," Jon said. "Perhaps, but it is my mistake to make." Jon let it go. He was a bastard. He could advise, but he could not command. And the gap between those two things was the gap through which disasters fell. The weeks that followed Robb's marriage were consumed by diplomacy, military repositioning, and the slow unraveling of the alliances that had sustained the northern campaign. The Freys withdrew from Robb's army, taking their soldiers and their bridge and their strategic choke point. The Karstarks, whose Lord Rickard had demanded the execution of Lannister prisoners in revenge for his sons' deaths and had been refused, grew restless and resentful. The lords of the Riverlands, exhausted by a war fought on their lands with their crops and their people, began to question whether the king in the north was capable of ending the conflict before it destroyed them. The army shrank as alliances frayed. Soldiers who had marched south with conviction drifted north with doubt. Supply lines that had been reliable became uncertain. The momentum that had carried Robb from Winterfell to the Whispering Wood to the fords of the Red Fork had slowed to a crawl, and the war that had begun as a righteous rescue was becoming a grinding occupation that benefited no one. Robb needed the Freys back. The strategic reality was inescapable. Without the twins, his supply lines to the north were cut, his retreat path was blocked, and his army was stranded in the Riverlands with dwindling food and deteriorating morale. "Go to the twins," Catelyn said. "Apologize, offer Edmure in your place." The Freys wanted a connection to a great house. Edmure Tully is the heir to Riverrun. The match is arguably better than a king who has already proven he breaks his word. It was a good plan. It was a necessary plan. And the man they were apologizing to was Walder Frey, who had spent 90 years nursing every slight and remembering every insult, and who considered forgiveness a weakness practiced by lesser men. Jon did not like it. The feeling was not rational, not the product of intelligence or information, but the deep, instinctive unease of a fighter who could feel danger the way some men could feel weather. Something about the twins, about the necessity of going there, about the specific vulnerability of placing their king inside another lord's castle, tripped a warning in a part of his mind that operated below conscious thought. The same instinct that let him see a sword stroke before it arrived was telling him that something about this journey was wrong, and he could not name it, and he could not prove it, and he could not ignore it. "Let me go in first," Jon said to Robb, the night before they were to reach the twins. A small party. Me, a dozen men. I speak to Frey, assess the situation, and send word back. You want to scout a wedding feast. I want to make sure a wedding feast is all it is. Robb smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a king who had been fighting for too long and who wanted desperately to believe that some problems could be solved with an apology and a marriage rather than a sword. "Jon, you see danger in everything. It is what makes you extraordinary on a battlefield and exhausting at a dinner table. We are going to the twins for a wedding. Walder Frey is many things, but he will not violate guest right. No man in Westeros is that far gone. Guest right has never been tested against a man with Walder Frey's sense of grievance. We go together, all of us. That is the point. Showing up with my full court, my mother, my wife, my brother, tells Frey that I trust him. Sending a scout tells him I do not." Jon looked at his brother. The argument was not wrong. The argument was also the product of a mind that had been at war for a year and wanted something, anything, to be simple. "I do not like it," Jon said. "You do not have to like it. You have to attend." They arrived at the twins on a cold afternoon when the sky was the color of iron and the Green Fork ran grey and sluggish between the twin castles. The castle was less a fortress than a toll gate, two squat towers connected by a bridge, built without beauty or ambition by a family whose entire identity was defined by its position rather than its qualities. Walder Frey received them in his hall, a stooped and withered man surrounded by sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, each one watching the northern party with eyes that calculated and assessed and gave nothing away. "Your Grace." The old lord's voice was thin and sharp. "Come to beg my pardon, have you? Come to apologize for throwing my daughter aside like a used horse? I have come to make amends, Lord Frey, and to offer a match that honors your house. Edmure Tully." Frey's lips pulled back from his gums, the heir to Riverrun for the king who couldn't keep his word. A poor trade, some might say. A generous one, Robb said, and a sincere one. Frey studied him. The old eyes were sharp behind the riem, the intelligence undimmed by age. He looked at Robb, then at Catelyn, then at Talisa, then at Jon. His gaze lingered on Jon. "The famous bastard," Frey said. "The one who beat the Kingslayer. They say you are the best sword in Westeros. They say many things, my lord. They say you could cut through my entire guard and walk out of this castle untouched. Is that true?" The question was casual. The calculation behind it was not, "I have no intention of cutting through your guard, Lord Frey. We are guests." "I guests," Frey smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes, and the gap between the smile and the eyes was wide enough to hide anything. "Well, let us feast. Let us celebrate. let us put this unpleasantness behind us. The wedding feast was held that evening in the great hall of the twins. Edmure Tully married Roslyn Frey in a ceremony that was perfunctory and a feast that was lavish. The tables groaning with food and the wine flowing with the particular generosity of a host who wanted his guests comfortable and off guard. Jon drank sparingly. He sat at the high table beside Robb, Ghost lying at his feet, and he watched the hall with the attention of a man who could not stop being a fighter even when the fighting was supposed to be over. The unease had not faded. If anything, it had sharpened since they entered the castle, pressing against the inside of his ribs like a blade that had not yet been drawn. The music was too loud. The servants moved with a tension that did not match the occasion. The Frey men at the lower tables were not drinking, or not drinking much, and several of them were wearing mail beneath their feast clothes. The subtle bulge of armor visible to an eye trained to look for weapons. Jon leaned toward Robb. Something is wrong. Jon. The guards have changed. There were 12 at the doors when we entered. There are 20 now. And the Frey men are armed. Robb's eyes moved across the hall. He was a soldier, not a natural politician. But he was not a fool, and the details Jon was pointing out were details that became visible once someone forced you to look. You are certain? I am certain something is wrong. I am not certain what. Robb's hand moved to his side, where his sword was not, because you did not wear a sword to a wedding feast. Jon's hand moved to his own side, where his blade was also absent, and the absence of the weapon felt like a missing limb. The music changed. The Rains of Castamere. The song that Tywin Lannister had composed for the destruction of House Rain. The song that every lord in Westeros recognized as the Lannister victory anthem, playing in the hall of Walder Frey at the wedding of Edmure Tully. Jon stood. The movement was instinctive, the reaction of a body that had been trained to respond to danger before the mind could process the reason. Ghost surged to his feet beside him, the direwolf's hackles rising. A low growl building in his chest that was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the floor and into the bones of everyone standing near. The doors closed. The sound of heavy bars dropping into brackets echoed through the hall like the crack of breaking bone. Catelyn rose from her seat, her face white, her eyes finding Roose Bolton at the far end of the high table. Bolton, who was supposed to be in the north retaking Winterfell. Bolton, who was sitting at the Frey feast with an expression of perfect calm while the Lannister song played. Robb, Catelyn said. Robb, get up. Get up now. The crossbows appeared from behind the gallery screens. The first volley came before anyone in the hall could move, a rain of bolts that turned the feast tables into killing fields. Men screamed. Bodies fell. Wine mixed with blood on the stone floor, and the sound of the two liquids meeting was the sound of a world ending. Jon moved. He did not think. The part of his mind that processed information, weighed options, calculated risks, was too slow for what was happening. The part that had been honed by years of relentless training, the part that existed below thought and above instinct, took control. He grabbed the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a carving knife from the feast table, and he threw himself between Robb and the crossbow bolts with a speed that the men who survived the night would later describe as inhuman. A bolt hit his shoulder. The impact was a white-hot spike that spun him sideways, and he felt the barbed point grind against bone. And the pain was enormous, and he ignored it completely. Because pain was a signal, and the signal was irrelevant when the alternative was death. He pulled a sword from a dead Stark guard's hand. The blade was shorter than he preferred, and the balance was wrong. A heavy infantry weapon designed for chopping rather than the fluid style Jon favored. But a sword was a sword, and Jon Snow, with a weapon in his hand, was a different creature than Jon Snow without one. The Frey soldiers came through the side doors. Dozens of them, armed and armored, pouring into the hall with the overwhelming numbers of men executing a plan that depended on surprise and superiority and the helplessness of unarmed guests. Jon killed the first 3 before they cleared the doorway. The movements were so fast that the soldiers behind them did not immediately understand what had happened. One moment, 3 men were charging through the door. The next moment, 3 men were on the floor, and the dark-haired bastard was standing over them with a borrowed sword and blood running from his shoulder and an expression on his face that made the 4th man through the door hesitate for the fraction of a second that killed him. Ghost hit the line from the flank. The white direwolf was 150 pounds of muscle and fury. And the sound he made as he tore into the Frey soldiers was a sound that belonged to the deep places of the world where men were not the dominant predator. The soldiers who faced the wolf and the swordsman simultaneously faced a problem that their training had not prepared them for, because no amount of drills could prepare a man for the experience of being attacked by 2 creatures who operated as a single mind. Robb. Move. Jon fought his way back to the high table, cutting a path through the Frey men who were trying to reach the king. A crossbow bolt hissed past his ear. Another hit the table beside him and splintered the wood. He reached Robb and found his brother on his feet, a table leg in his hands, fighting with the desperate fury of a man who had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Catelyn had a knife. She had grabbed Jinglebell Frey, old Walder's grandson, and held the blade to the simpleton's throat. And her voice was cutting through the chaos with the fierce clarity of a woman who was willing to kill an innocent to save her son. Stop this, or I will cut his throat. Lord Walder, stop this. Walder Frey watched from his seat at the head of the hall. His face showed nothing. His eyes moved between Catelyn and Robb and Jon. And the calculation behind them was the calculation of a man who had already made his bargain and was watching it play out. You already killed my hospitality, Frey said. The boy is a half-wit. Cut him if you like. Jon reached Robb. He handed his brother a sword taken from a fallen Frey soldier and positioned himself between Robb and the nearest cluster of attackers. The side door, Jon said. Kitchen passage. It leads to the river gate. My mother. I will get her. Move, Jon. Now. Robb. Go now. Robb looked at his brother. The moment lasted less than a second and contained everything they had ever been to each other. The yard at Winterfell, the marches, the battles, the quiet conversations in tents, the bond that no amount of politics or prejudice had been able to break. Robb went. He fought his way toward the side door with Grey Wind clearing the path ahead of him, and the soldiers who tried to stop the direwolf learned the same lesson that Jaime's guards had learned at the Whispering Wood, which was that a direwolf was not a large dog and should not be treated as one. Jon turned to Catelyn. She was still holding Jinglebell. The knife was shaking in her hand. Around her, the hall was a nightmare of blood and screaming, and the ugly sounds of men dying in a space too small for the violence being done in it. Lady Stark. We are leaving. Catelyn looked at him. Her eyes were wild with grief and fury and something else. Something that Jon had never seen in her face before. Recognition. The recognition that the bastard boy she had spent a lifetime resenting was the only thing standing between her family and annihilation. She released Jinglebell. She took Jon's offered hand. And they ran. The corridor was narrow, stone-walled, lit by torches in iron brackets that threw jumping shadows across the ceiling. The first Frey soldier appeared around a corner 10 yards ahead, a heavy-set man with a short sword and the wide eyes of someone who had not expected resistance. Jon killed him with a thrust that used the corridor's geometry, driving the blade through the gap between wall and shield where the man's arm met his torso. The body fell and partially blocked the passage, and the second and third men who came around the corner had to step over it, which slowed them, which killed them. Ghost worked the rear. The White Wolf faced the pursuit with the calm deliberation of a predator who had been bred for exactly this kind of violence, and the sounds he made as he dealt with the soldiers who tried to follow were sounds that belonged to the oldest nightmares of men, who had forgotten what it meant to share the world with things that could eat them. Catelyn moved between the 2 points of protection, her face white and set and showing no fear, because Catelyn Stark had passed beyond fear into the territory beyond it, where the only thing that remained was the absolute determination to survive. The 4th and 5th men came together, coordinated, shields locked. a paired advance designed to overwhelm a single defender through width rather than skill. Jon let them come. He retreated 2 steps, drawing them forward, and then stopped and dropped low and struck the leading man's leg below the shield line. The soldier folded. His partner stumbled over him, and Jon's blade found the gap between helmet and gorget, and the corridor was open again. The 6th man was better than the others. A professional soldier, older, with the controlled movements of a man who had fought in real battles rather than garrison duty. He came at Jon with a measured advance, his shield work tight, his sword hand patient. Jon recognized quality. He also recognized that quality without exceptional speed was quality that would lose, and the exchange lasted 4 heartbeats before the professional soldier joined the others on the stone floor. 7, 8. Jon counted without deciding to count. The way a swordsman's body keeps track of things the mind is too busy to notice. His shoulder was screaming now, the bolt wound opening with every overhead strike, and the blood running down his left arm was making the grip on his borrowed sword slippery. He compensated by adjusting his technique, shifting to a style that favored his right side and minimized the involvement of his wounded left. The shift would have been invisible to anyone watching. A subtle change in angle and weight distribution that preserved his effectiveness while reducing the strain on his injury. Jon had never practiced fighting wounded. The adaptation was instinctive, the product of a body that understood its own mechanics, the way a musician's hands understand their instrument. Jon fought through the corridor with Catelyn behind him and Ghost behind her, and the narrowness of the passage was his advantage because only 1 or 2 men could face him at a time. And 1 or 2 men at a time was not enough to stop Jon Snow with a sword. The corridor was lit by torches in iron brackets, and the light made the fighting a sequence of shadows and steel. And the sound of the blade striking bone and armor echoed off the stone walls in a rhythm that was the rhythm of survival. He killed 11 men between the Great Hall and the River Gate. He fought with the shoulder wound bleeding and his left arm weakening, and the borrowed sword growing heavier with every swing. And each of the 11 men he killed was a moment where the mathematics of exhaustion and injury came closer to catching up with the mathematics of skill. The 9th man nearly got him. A big Frey soldier with a mace who swung for Jon's head while Jon was pulling his blade from the 8th man's chest. Jon ducked the mace by an inch, felt the wind of it pass over his scalp, and killed the man with a thrust that used the last reserves of speed his wounded shoulder could produce. They reached the river gate. Robb was there, Greywind beside him, his face splattered with blood that was not his own. Talisa was with him, unhurt, clutching his arm with both hands. A dozen Stark soldiers who had fought their way out formed a defensive ring, their swords drawn, and their faces showing the white, shocked expression of men who had just survived something they would never understand. "Can you ride?" Robb asked Jon. "I can ride." They rode. They crossed the Green Fork at a shallow downstream of the Twins and disappeared into the darkness of the Riverlands, with the sounds of the castle fading behind them, and the last thing Jon heard before the night swallowed them was the rains of Castamere still playing in the great hall where the dead lay piled among the feast tables. The Red Wedding killed the war. It did not kill Robb Stark because Jon Snow's sword had prevented that. But it killed the army, the alliance, the momentum, and the belief that the North could win its independence through force of arms. 2/3 of the Northern lords who had ridden to the Twins were dead or captured. The Frey and Bolton forces, acting in concert with Tywin Lannister's instructions, had destroyed the leadership of the Northern Rebellion in a single night of treachery. Robb escaped with perhaps 400 men, a fraction of the force he had commanded that morning. Catelyn was with him, and Talisa, and Jon, and Ghost, and a handful of lords who had survived through luck or speed or the particular mercy of being seated near the exits. The Gratjon was captured. Lord Karstark's remaining sons were killed. The Manderley forces were decimated. The army that had marched south as the pride of the North limped northward as a ragged band of survivors. And the king who led them was a king without a kingdom, a title without an army to enforce it. They moved north through enemy territory, avoiding roads, sleeping in forests, eating what they could find and what the wolves could catch. Ghost ranged ahead of the column each night, returning before dawn with blood on his muzzle and the quiet satisfaction of a predator who had fed. Grey Wind did the same, and the two wolves between them kept the small band alive through country that was hostile and sparse and thick with Lannister patrols. Jon's shoulder wound festered for 3 days before a hedgemaster they found in a burned village cleaned it and stitched it properly, and the fever that preceded the treatment left him weakened in a way that no wound had managed before. He lay in a barn while the fever burned, drifting between consciousness and something deeper, and in the deeper place he dreamed of Winterfell and the yard and the sound of steel and the face of his father looking down from the wall on the morning the column left. He recovered. He always recovered. But the recovery was slower this time, and the silence that accompanied it was deeper, and the look in his eyes when he stared into the campfire was the look of a man who was reassessing everything he had believed about what a sword could accomplish. He had been the greatest swordsman in Westeros at the Red Wedding. He had killed 11 men in a corridor and fought his way through a massacre. And none of it had prevented the betrayal. None of it had stopped Walder Frey from closing the doors. None of it had stopped Roose Bolton from sitting in the gallery, with the calm assurance of a man who had already sold his king to the highest bidder. A sword could cut through flesh. It could not cut through treachery. A sword could save 1 person, or 2, or 12. It could not save an army. The finest blade in the world was exactly as useful as the political structure around it, and when the structure collapsed, the blade was just a piece of steel. Jon understood this now. The understanding did not make him less dangerous. It made him more dangerous, because a man who understood the limits of his weapon was a man who would learn to use other weapons too. They reached the north after 3 weeks of hard travel. The neck swallowed them the way the neck always swallowed fugitives, its marshes and crannogs and hidden waterways providing cover that no pursuing army could penetrate. The water was dark and still, the paths invisible to anyone who did not know the land, and the sounds of the marsh, the frogs and the insects and the distant calls of birds that had no names in the common tongue, wrapped around the small band of survivors and hid them from the world. Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch and Ned Stark's oldest living friend, met them in the swamps with guides and food and the quiet, practical support of a man who had been waiting for this day since the war began. Howland was small and slight and unremarkable in every way that mattered on a battlefield, and essential in every way that mattered everywhere else. He had fought beside Ned at the Tower of Joy. He had kept Ned's secrets for 17 years. And he looked at Jon Snow with an expression that was too knowing, too careful, as if he were looking at something that Jon could not see. "Your father would be proud of you," Howland told Jon, standing at the edge of a crannog while the mist rose from the water and the frogs sang in the reeds. "My father is dead. The war he started is lost. The war your brother started. The war the Lannisters provoked. The war that Ned went south to prevent." Howland studied Jon with that careful expression. "You look like him, you know. Not Ned, someone else." "Who?" Howland was quiet for a long time. The mist moved around them, and the frogs sang, and somewhere in the marsh a bird cried out and went silent. "Perhaps I will tell you someday," Howland said. "When the time is right." Jon did not press. He had learned patience from the sword, and he applied it to conversations the same way he applied it to combat. Wait for the opening, and act when it arrives. The north was occupied. Bolton held Winterfell, not as Robb's regent, but as the Warden of the North, a title given to him by the Lannisters in exchange for his betrayal. Ramsay Bolton, Roose's bastard son, held the castle with a cruelty that made the Ironborn occupation seem gentle by comparison. The northern lords who had not marched south were divided between those who had submitted to Bolton rule and those who were hiding in their castles, waiting for something to change. Bran and Rickon had escaped Winterfell before the Boltons arrived. That was the one piece of good news. The boys had fled north with the wildling woman Osha and the simpleton Hodor, and their trail had disappeared into the Wolfswood, where the Boltons could not follow and would not find them. Robb established his court in exile at the Crannog, a king in a swamp, planning the reconquest of a kingdom he had lost through a combination of his own mistakes and another man's treachery. The irony was not lost on him. He had ridden south as the king in the north, the young wolf, the leader of an army that had never lost a battle. He had returned as a fugitive with 400 men and a name that half the realm now associated with failure. "We retake Winterfell," Robb said, in a council that consisted of himself, Catelyn, Jon, and the handful of lords who had survived. "We rally the houses that have not bent to Bolton. We build a force. And we take back our home." "With what?" Jon asked. 400 men against a fortified castle, held by a garrison of thousands? "With the North." The lords did not choose Bolton. They submitted because they had no alternative. If a Stark stands before them and asks for their swords, they will give them. "If," Jon said. "A king who lost his army at a wedding feast is not the same as a king who won every battle he fought. The lords will wonder whether following you again will lead them to another twins." The words were harsh. Jon said them because they were true, and because someone had to, and because the brotherhood between them had always been built on a foundation of honesty that no amount of politics could erode. Robb absorbed the words. His face tightened, then relaxed, then settled into the expression of a man who is learning the difference between being right and being effective. "Then, you stand beside me," Robb said. "Jon Snow, the Wolf's Fang, the man who beat the Kingslayer and fought through the Red Wedding. If my name is damaged, yours is not. The lords will follow you. They cannot follow a bastard. They can follow a Stark." Robb reached into his cloak and produced a document, rolled and sealed with the direwolf stamp. "I signed it a month ago. I have been carrying it since before the twins. Legitimization. You are Jon Stark, if you accept it." Jon looked at the scroll. The firelight reflected off the wax seal, and the direwolf pressed into it was the same direwolf that had flown above him every day of his life, without ever truly belonging to him. "Your mother." "My mother was the one who suggested it." Jon looked at Catelyn. She sat across the fire from him, her face drawn and old and fierce. And the expression she wore was not warmth, and was not acceptance, and was not anything as simple as a single emotion. It was the expression of a woman who had lost everything except her children and her pride, and who had decided that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "You saved Robb's life," Catelyn said. "You saved mine. Whatever else you are, Jon Snow, you are the reason my son is alive. I will not pretend to love you, but I will not pretend you have not earned this." The silence that followed was the most significant silence of Jon's life. He held the scroll in his hands and felt the weight of it, not the physical weight of paper and wax, but the weight of everything it represented. A name, a family, a belonging. The thing he had wanted since he was old enough to understand what he was missing. He thought of Ned. He thought of the morning in the solar when his father had refused to let him go to the wall. "Stay at Winterfell. Robb will need you." Had Ned known? Had he seen this future? Somehow, the way that fathers sometimes see the shape of their children's lives before the children themselves can make it out? "I accept," Jon said. "Jon Stark." The name felt strange in his mouth and stranger in his mind, a garment that fit perfectly and yet belonged to someone he was still becoming. The northern lords who had remained loyal used it immediately, as if they had been waiting for permission to acknowledge what they had already decided. The bastard was a Stark. The greatest swordsman in Westeros had a name. The campaign to retake the north began in the deep of winter. They started small. Robb and Jon rode from holdfast to holdfast, two brothers and a direwolf and a growing band of soldiers, asking for loyalty and receiving it with a frequency that surprised even Catelyn's cautious expectations. The Mormonts came first, Bear Island pledging its warriors with the blunt enthusiasm that was the Mormont way. Lady Mage looked Jon up and down with the appraising eye of a woman who had fought more battles than most men, and she pronounced him acceptable, which from a Mormont was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Hornwoods followed, then the Cerwyns, then the mountain clans, fierce and independent, and offended by the idea of a Bolton sitting in Winterfell, The mountain clans came down from their valleys with axes and fur cloaks, and the particular ferocity of people who had survived 10,000 winters and intended to survive 10,000 more. They pledged to the Starks, not because of politics, but because of something older. A loyalty that lived in the blood and the stone and the memory of the first men who had carved their homes from the mountains before history began. Jon's name was the key that opened doors Robb's alone could not. The lords had heard the stories, the Kingslayer's defeat, the battles won. The Red Wedding, where a bastard with a borrowed sword had fought through a massacre and carried his king to safety. They had heard, and they believed, and when Jon Stark stood before them and asked for their swords, they gave them not because of the Stark name on a scroll, but because of the Stark steel in his hand. The Glovers were the hardest to convince. Lord Glover had bent the knee to the Boltons after the Red Wedding, not from cowardice, but from the practical calculation that a living lord could protect his people while a dead hero could not. When Jon and Robb stood in his hall and asked for his sword, Glover's face carried the particular shame of a man who had done the expedient thing and now had to face the principled men he had abandoned. "I turned my back on your brother," Glover said. "I have no right to stand beside him now." "You turned your back on a losing cause," Jon said. "Every lord in the north did the same, and every lord in the north is doing the same arithmetic right now, calculating whether the Starks can win before deciding whether to risk their people on the attempt. I am not here to judge your arithmetic, Lord Glover. I am here to change it." "How?" "By telling you that the Boltons hold Winterfell with 3,000 men and a bastard whose cruelty is the only thing that holds his army together. Cruelty is not loyalty, it is fear, and fear breaks the moment something more frightening appears. I intend to be that something." Glover looked at the young man standing in his hall. Jon Stark, the bastard turned legitimate, the swordsman whose name had travelled from the Whispering Wood to the Wall and back again, the man who had fought through the Red Wedding and carried the king in the north to safety. The man had no army, no gold, no political leverage. He had a name, a wolf, and a sword. And Glover, who had spent his career calculating odds and hedging bets, looked at Jon Stark and saw something that his calculations could not account for, which was the absolute certainty of a man who would win or die attempting to, and who had no interest in any outcome between those two extremes. "You will have the Glovers," he said. "Gods help us all." By the time the army reached the outskirts of Winterfell, it numbered nearly 5,000. Not enough for a conventional siege, more than enough for what Jon had planned. Ramsay Bolton held the castle with 3,000 men and the particular confidence of a man whose cruelty had always been sufficient to control the people around him. He had heard the reports of the Stark army's approach, and he had responded by flaying 3 captured scouts and hanging their skins from the walls. Because Ramsay Bolton communicated through horror and considered it a more effective language than words. The skins hung from the battlements like flags, pale and terrible, and the soldiers in Jon's army who saw them felt the cold settle deeper into their bones. Jon studied Winterfell from a ridge 2 miles south of the castle. The grey walls rose from the winter landscape like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The Stark banners were gone, replaced by the flayed man of Bolton, red and pink, an obscenity against the grey stone that Jon had known his entire life. "He will not come out," Robb said, standing beside him. "He has the walls and the garrison and the supplies. He can wait for spring. He does not have the temperament to wait." Ramsay Bolton is a man who needs to prove himself. A man who sits behind walls while his enemies gather is a man who looks weak. And Ramsay cannot afford to look weak because weakness is the only thing his followers fear more than he does. You think he will fight. I think he will fight because he cannot help himself. He will see 5,000 men outside his walls, and he will calculate that 3,000 behind stone is stronger than 5,000 in the snow, and he will decide to come out and crush us, because the crushing is the part he enjoys. Jon was right. Ramsay Bolton rode out the following morning with his full garrison, 3,000 men in Bolton Red, his archers on the flanks and his cavalry in the center and his own person at the rear, where he could watch the battle unfold with the distant satisfaction of a man who considered violence entertainment. The Battle of Winterfell was fought in the snow. Jon commanded the center. He positioned his infantry in a crescent formation that invited the Bolton charge, and then bent around it, drawing the enemy deeper into a pocket that grew narrower with every step forward. It was a formation that required discipline and timing and the absolute trust of the soldiers who held the wings, and Jon had spent weeks drilling the army until the movements were as natural as breathing. The snow fell throughout the battle, large, slow flakes that settled on armor and cloaks and the faces of the dead, blurring the line between white ground and grey sky until the world became a single, undifferentiated space of movement and noise, and the red stain of blood on snow. Ramsay's cavalry hit the center and pushed through, exactly as Jon intended. The Bolton horses drove deep into the northern line, and the line gave way, and the Bolton commanders felt the exhilaration of a breakthrough that was, in fact, a trap. Jon closed the pocket. The wings swung inward. The Bolton cavalry, strung out and disorganized after the charge, found themselves surrounded by infantry who were not retreating but advancing, and the battle devolved into the close. Savage fighting where numbers and position mattered more than momentum. Jon fought in the center of the press. He had chosen this position deliberately, not because a commander should fight in the line, but because the soldiers needed to see him, needed to know that Jon Stark, the greatest swordsman in Westeros, was standing in the mud beside them and swinging his blade with the same desperate fury they were. The swordwork he displayed that day surpassed anything he had done at the Whispering Wood or the Red Fork, or any of the battles that had built his legend. He fought for 2 hours without rest, in the crush of bodies, and the stink of blood, and the screaming that was the true sound of war, and every man he fought went down, and every man who replaced the one who fell went down too. And the space around Jon became a killing floor that the Bolton soldiers began to avoid the way water avoids a stone. The pivot came in the second hour. Ramsay's cavalry, trapped in the pocket Jon had designed, began to break. The first riders who fled the press were cut down by the encircling infantry, but the attempt itself spread through the Bolton ranks like a disease. The panic of men who realize they are surrounded and outnumbered and led by a commander who values their suffering more than their survival. Bolton's soldiers began throwing down their swords. First individuals, then groups, then entire companies, the surrender spreading from the center of the pocket outward as the psychological collapse outpaced the physical fighting. Jon stopped killing. The transition was immediate, a decision made between one heartbeat and the next, and the soldiers around him saw it happen and understood it without being told. The fighting stopped spreading from Jon's position like ripples from a stone dropped in water. The cessation of violence traveling outward through the northern ranks as soldiers took their cue from the commander who had been killing men for 2 hours and had decided, in an instant, that the killing was done. The remaining Bolton soldiers surrendered in the snow. They knelt with their weapons beside them, and their heads down, and their faces showing the particular exhaustion of men who had survived something that should have killed them, and were not yet certain they were grateful. Robb came through the lines to find Jon standing in the center of what had been the battle's densest fighting. The snow around him was trampled and red. The borrowed sword in his hand was notched and dulled. His face was spattered with blood that was not his own, and his eyes held the flat, distant expression of a man who was returning from a place inside himself, where the business of killing was conducted efficiently and without emotion. "It is done," Robb said. Jon looked at his brother. The distance closed, the eyes came back, and what returned to Jon's face was not triumph, but something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that he had just done the thing he was made for, and the thing he was made for was terrible, and the world needed it anyway. Ghost fought beside him. The white direwolf was a streak of white in the grey and red chaos, and the soldiers who saw the wolf and the swordsman fighting together would later say it was like watching a single creature with 2 bodies, moving in a coordination that no amount of training could produce. Ramsay Bolton died at Jon's hand. It was not a duel. Ramsay was not a fighter, not in the way that mattered. He was a torturer, a bully, a man who inflicted pain on the helpless and called it strength. When the battle turned and his soldiers broke and the northern army closed around his position, Ramsay tried to flee, and Jon ran him down on horseback, and the confrontation that followed was less a fight than a conclusion. "Do you know who I am?" Ramsay asked, his voice carrying the thin bravado of a man who still believed his name meant something. "You are no one," Jon said. "You were always no one." The sword fell. Ramsay Bolton dropped into the snow, and the snow around him turned red, and the bastard of the Dreadfort died in the shadow of the castle he had stolen from the family that Jon had just reclaimed. They entered Winterfell through the Hunter's Gate as the sun was setting. The castle was unchanged and utterly changed. The stones were the same. The hot springs still warmed the walls. The godswood still stood with its heart tree and its dark pool. But the years of war and occupation had left marks that went deeper than the physical, a sense of violation that clung to the corridors and the halls like smoke that would not clear. Jon walked through the great hall and felt the ghosts of every meal he had eaten there, every feast where he had sat below the salt, every evening where he had watched the true-born Stark children and wondered what it felt like to belong at the high table. He was Jon Stark now. He could sit wherever he chose. The irony was that the victory tasted nothing like the belonging he had imagined. Robb's coronation, the second one, happened 3 days later in the great hall of Winterfell. The northern lords knelt and pledged and said the words, and Robb Stark was the king in the north again, and the crown sat on his head with a weight that was heavier than the first time, because he now understood what it could cost. "You are my heir," Robb told Jon, privately, in the solar that had been their father's. "Until I have children, you are next in line. I want that understood by the lords, by the council, by everyone. Robb, I lost everything because I was arrogant and careless, and because the people I trusted were not worthy of the trust. You saved what could be saved. You rebuilt what could be rebuilt. If anything happens to me, the North needs a Stark who will not repeat my mistakes." Jon accepted. There was nothing else to do. The boy who had wanted only to belong was now the heir to a kingdom, and the sword that had brought him there felt heavier than any weapon should. The months that followed were consumed by the work of rebuilding. The North had been ravaged by war, occupation, and winter, and the damage ran deeper than burned crops and empty holdfasts. Trust had been broken. Lords who had bent to the Boltons had to be reconciled or replaced. The economy of the North, never wealthy, had been stripped by years of conflict. Food stores that should have lasted through winter had been plundered by occupying forces, and the harvests that should have replenished them had never been planted. The wall, which sent increasingly desperate ravens, was undermanned and undersupplied, and the reports from Castle Black spoke of threats beyond the wall that no one in Winterfell had time to properly address. Jon governed alongside Robb with a competence that surprised people who expected a swordsman to be useless at administration. He was not a natural politician. He did not enjoy the meetings, the negotiations, the careful balancing of competing interests that consumed most of a lord's waking hours. But he approached governance the way he approached sword work, with relentless focus, methodical preparation, and the understanding that excellence was a product of practice rather than talent. He learned to read people the way he read opponents, watching for the small movements that betrayed intention. A lord who folded his arms during a negotiation was a lord who had already decided and was performing the appearance of consideration. A merchant who spoke too quickly was a merchant who was afraid his numbers would not survive scrutiny. A steward who kept his ledgers too neat was a steward who had something to hide in their neatness. Catelyn watched him with an expression that had evolved from resentment through grudging respect to something that was almost, but not quite, warmth. She would never love him. The wound was too old and too deep and too tangled with the memory of her husband bringing a bastard home from the war. But she had stopped seeing him as a threat, and what she saw instead was a young man who carried Ned's sense of duty without Ned's political blindness, and who wielded power with the careful restraint of someone who had never expected to hold it. "You are more like Ned than Robb is," she told him once, and the observation was not entirely a compliment, because Ned's qualities had led Ned to a headsman's block. "I am trying to be better than either of us," Jon said. Better than Ned? Ned was honorable, and he died because honor was not enough. Robb was brave, and he nearly died because bravery was not enough. I want to be the thing that is enough. What thing is that? Jon did not answer, because he did not know. The sword had not been enough. The name had not been enough. The victories had not been enough. The thing he was searching for, the quality or capacity or understanding that would make everything cohere, remained just out of reach, like a movement in a fight that he could feel approaching but could not yet execute. The raven from the wall arrived on a morning when the courtyard was white with new snow and the castle was quiet with the hush that fell when winter pressed close. Lord Commander Mormont was dead. The Night's Watch had mutinied, and the brothers who had killed the old bear had themselves been killed in the aftermath, and the order had collapsed into a fraction of its former strength. The few brothers who remained were exhausted, frightened, and led by a temporary commander whose primary qualification was being the least objectionable option. The wildlings were massing beyond the wall in numbers that the watch could not contain, and behind the wildlings, something else was moving. Something old. Something cold. The reports were confused and frightened and contained descriptions that sounded like madness unless you believed in the stories that old Nan had told in the dark. White Walkers. Jon read The Raven in Robb Solar and felt the cold settle into his bones in a way that had nothing to do with winter. This is real, Jon said. It cannot be real. The White Walkers are a story. The direwolves were a story. Until they were not. Robb looked at him. The young king's face showed the particular tension of a man whose list of problems had just grown longer than his capacity to address them. I cannot fight a war on two fronts. The South is still hostile. The Lannisters still hold the throne. The Freys and Boltons may be broken, but their allies are not. And now you want me to believe that an army of the dead is marching on the wall. I do not want you to believe it. I want you to prepare for the possibility. With what? We barely have enough men to hold the north. Jon stood at the window. The snow was falling in thick, slow spirals, and the light had the grey, flat quality of a sky that would not clear for months. Beyond the walls of Winterfell, the Wolfswood stretched north, dark and dense and ancient, and beyond the Wolfswood, the open lands that ran to the wall, and beyond the wall, whatever was coming. Let me go north, Jon said. Let me take a force to Castle Black. Assess the situation. If the reports are madness, I come back. If they are not, we need to know before the problem arrives at our gates. You are my heir. If I send my heir to the wall and something happens to him, then you name another heir. The North has Starks. You. Bran, if we find him, Rickon, the line is not as thin as you think. It is exactly as thin as I think. And I am not willing to lose you. Robb. Jon's voice was quiet, but carried the weight that quiet voices carry when the person speaking has earned the right to be heard. The wall is why Father kept me here. Stay at Winterfell, he said. And now, I understand why. Not because Winterfell needed another sword. Because the North needed someone who would go where the danger was and face it instead of pretending it did not exist. Robb was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled in the hearth. Ghost lay on the solar floor with his head on his paws, his red eyes open and watchful. Take 1,000 men, Robb said. Come back alive. Jon rode north with a force of 1,000 northerners and arrived at Castle Black to find the wall manned by a garrison of fewer than 200. The Night's Watch, after the mutiny, had collapsed to a skeleton of its former self. The castles along the wall were abandoned. The ranging parties had stopped. The wall itself, 700 feet of ice and ancient magic, stood as it had always stood. But the men who were supposed to guard it were no longer enough to man a single castle, let alone 19. Castle Black was a cold, half-empty place, its halls echoing with the footsteps of too few men in too large a fortress. The armory was understocked. The kitchens served thin porridge and salt beef. The training yard was unused because there was no one to train, and no time to train them. The wall had been forgotten by the realm it protected, and forgetting was a kind of betrayal that no treaty could undo. Jon walked the wall on his first morning at Castle Black. He climbed the ancient wooden lift to the top and stood 700 feet above the world and looked north. And what he saw was the largest silence he had ever experienced. The haunted forest stretched to the horizon, dark evergreen under grey sky, and the stillness of it was wrong. No smoke from wildling camps, no movement of hunting parties, no signs of the 100,000 people who were supposed to be living in that vast wilderness. The forest looked abandoned, evacuated, as if everything alive had already fled south and left behind only the trees and the snow and whatever was driving the flight. He walked the wall itself, following the narrow ice path along its top, moving east until Castle Black was a small cluster of buildings behind him, and the only sound was the wind. The ice beneath his feet was ancient, dense, blue, in places where the pressure of 8,000 years had compressed it beyond the natural limits of frozen water. The wall was not simply a fortification. It was a monument to a fear so profound that an entire civilization had mobilized to build 700 feet of ice across 300 miles of wilderness. And that fear, whatever had produced it, was the same fear he had seen in Sam Tarly's eyes. The ranging reports were stacked on the temporary commander's desk in bundles that represented the Watch's last year of operations. Jon read them systematically, the way he had learned to read terrain, looking for patterns rather than details. The patterns were clear. Wildling settlements abandoned. Ranger patrols that went north and did not return. Cold spots in the forest where the temperature dropped 30 degrees in the space of 100 yards and the trees were coated with a frost that did not melt even in direct sunlight. And bodies. Bodies that were found and burned, and sometimes, according to the more frightened reports, found and burned, and then found again the next morning, standing upright in the snow where they had been ash the day before. Sam Tarly was the first person Jon met who could explain what was happening beyond the wall in terms that made sense. Sam was fat, timid, brilliant, and possessed of a knowledge of the Watch's history and lore that no one else at Castle Black could match. He had been sent to the wall by a father who considered him a disgrace, and he had survived the experience by becoming the one thing that even the hardest men of the Watch could not dismiss, which was indispensable. He knew the old texts. He knew the records. He knew the stories that the maesters dismissed as legend, and the legends that the stories had simplified into nonsense. He sat across from Jon in the Lord Commander's quarters, an office that was empty because there was no Lord Commander. And he laid out the situation with the methodical precision of a man whose fear was exceeded only by his compulsion to understand. "The wildlings are running," Sam said. "Not attacking. Running. Mance Rayder has gathered every clan, every tribe, every group between here and the lands of Always Winter, and he is bringing them south, not because he wants to conquer the Seven Kingdoms, but because something behind him is worse than anything in front of him. White Walkers. We have seen them. I have seen them." Sam's voice shook. His hands, folded on the table, trembled visibly, and the trembling was not from the cold. At a place called the Fist of the First Men. They came in the night with an army of dead men, and the dead men killed the living men, and the living men who died stood up and became dead men themselves. I watched it happen. I was there. He paused. The memory moved behind his eyes like something alive. They are not a story, Lord Stark. They are real, and they are coming, and the wall is the only thing between them and the living, and the wall has 200 men. How do you kill them? Fire, dragonglass, Valyrian steel. Sam's voice steadied when he spoke about facts rather than memories. The old texts are specific. Ordinary weapons do nothing. The White Walkers carry a cold that shatters normal steel. But Valyrian steel holds. Dragonglass, which the maesters call obsidian, kills them on contact. And fire damages the whites, the dead soldiers, though it does not stop the walkers themselves. Jon stood on top of the wall that evening. The ice stretched east and west as far as he could see. A ribbon of frozen white between the darkness of the north and the darkness of the sky. The wind was savage. The cold was a living thing that pressed against every surface and found every gap. 700 feet below, Castle Black was a cluster of lights and shadows, tiny and fragile against the vastness of the wall. He looked north. The wilderness beyond the wall was white and vast and silent, and the silence was the silence of something waiting. The greatest swordsman in Westeros stood 700 feet above the ground with a sword on his hip and a wolf at his side, and for the first time in his life he understood what he was for. Not the war in the south, not the politics of kings and lords and succession, not the fame or the name or the belonging. This, the wall, the boundary between the living and the dead, the place where swords mattered not because of the glory they could win, but because of the darkness they could hold back. He sent a raven to Winterfell that night. The message was brief. The reports are true. The wall needs men. The wall needs the greatest swordsman in Westeros. I am staying until the fight is done. Howland Reed arrived at Winterfell while Jon was at the wall, and what he carried was a story that had waited 17 years to be told. He spoke to Robb and Catelyn in the Solar, with the door closed and the guards dismissed, and the tale he told changed the shape of everything they thought they knew about the man they had just named heir. Jon Snow was not Ned Stark's bastard son. He was the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, born in a tower in Dorne while Ned fought a war to bring his sister home. Ned had found Lyanna dying, a newborn in her arms, and she had made him promise. "Promise me, Ned. Promise me you will protect him." And Ned, who had spent his entire life honoring promises, had brought the baby home and called it his own bastard, and endured his wife's pain and his own dishonor and the questions he could never answer, because the alternative was a murdered child. Robb heard the story and sat in silence for a very long time. "He is a Targaryen," Robb said. "He is your cousin," Catelyn said. Her voice was strange, carrying a tone that neither Robb nor Howland had heard from her before. Something had broken inside her, or perhaps something had finally been released. "He is Lyanna's son, Ned's nephew, not Ned's bastard. Never a bastard at all." The realization settled through her in layers. Every cold look she had given Jon, every time she had wished him gone, every moment of resentment and anger and the particular cruelty of a woman who blamed a child for a sin the child had never committed. None of it had been justified. The boy had been innocent. Ned had been faithful, and Catelyn had spent 15 years punishing them both for a lie that Ned had maintained to save a baby's life. She wept. She had not wept since the Red Wedding, but she wept now, silently, in the Solar that had been Ned's, surrounded by his books and his maps and the ghost of every conversation they had never finished. "He cannot know," Catelyn said, when the weeping stopped. "Not yet. If the Lannisters learn that Rhaegar's son is alive, they will not stop until he is dead." "He deserves to know," Robb said. "He deserves to live. The truth and his life may not be compatible. Not while the Lannisters hold the throne and the South and the power to send assassins to every corner of the realm. Then we tell him when the time is right, when the North is secure, when the Lannisters are no longer hunting Targaryens." The truth waited. It was good at waiting. It had waited 17 years already. At the wall, Jon prepared for a fight that was unlike anything he had trained for. The wildlings came first, 100,000 of them, pouring out of the haunted forest like a flood tide, driven by terror rather than ambition. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had united them through a combination of charisma, desperation, and the simple argument that the alternative to unity was extinction. Jon met Mance under a peace banner north of the wall. The two men faced each other across a fire, and the conversation that followed was the conversation that reoriented Jon's understanding of what his sword was for. Mance was tall and weathered and looked like what he was. A man who had lived his entire adult life beyond the boundaries of civilization and had survived through will and intelligence and the refusal to accept that the world had finished surprising him. He wore a cloak made of patches, dozens of different furs stitched together, and the cloak was itself a kind of statement, the visible symbol of a man who had built something from pieces that no one else wanted. "I did not come to conquer your kingdoms," Mance said. "I came because what is behind us kills everything it touches, and the dead do not stay dead. They rise. They fight for the other side. Every person who falls becomes a soldier in an army that does not tire, does not fear, and does not stop. You are asking me to let 100,000 wildlings through the wall. I am asking you to decide whether your wall protects against the living or the dead. Because it cannot do both. Jon looked at the man across the fire. Mance Rayder was not a king in any sense that Westeros would recognize. He was a former brother of the Night's Watch who had gone north and become something else. A leader of free people who followed him because he had earned their trust rather than inherited their obedience. If I let you through, Jon said, the Night's Watch will mutiny again. The Northern Lords will call me a traitor. The realm will see it as an invasion. And if you don't, everyone north of the wall dies. And then rises. And then your wall faces an army of 100,000 dead. The arithmetic was clear. The politics were impossible. And the choice was exactly the kind of choice that Jon had spent his life preparing for without knowing it. The choice between doing what was right and doing what was safe. He let them through. The gate opened, and the wildlings came through in a river of humanity that lasted 3 days. They came with their weapons, and their furs, and their children on their backs, and their old ones on litters, and the hard, suspicious faces of people who had spent their lives being told that the men on the other side of the wall were their enemies. Jon stood at the gate and watched them pass, and what he saw was not an army or an invasion or a political crisis. What he saw was 100,000 people who were afraid, and fear was a language he understood. The decision produced exactly the reaction he expected. Ravens flew from Castle Black, carrying outrage and accusation. Northern lords who had pledged to Robb called Jon a fool and a traitor. The Night's Watch brothers who remained split between those who understood the decision and those who considered it a betrayal of everything the Watch stood for. Jon weathered the anger the way the wall weathered the wind, by standing still and enduring and knowing that the thing behind the storm was worse than the storm itself. The White Walkers came with the first true blizzard. They came out of the north in silence, an army of frozen dead led by creatures that had not walked the world in 8,000 years. The Night King rode a dead horse at the front of a column that stretched to the horizon, and behind him came the Whites, thousands upon thousands of them, moving with the relentless patience of a force that had all the time in the world. The cold preceded them. It rolled across the landscape like a wave, freezing the ground and the air and the moisture in men's lungs. A cold so deep that torches guttered and fires shrank, and the warmth of the living retreated before the advance of the dead. The defense of the wall was the battle that defined Jon's life, and it was a battle that no amount of swordsmanship could win alone. He fought on the wall, and beneath it, and in front of it, coordinating the defense with the desperate improvisation of a commander whose resources were inadequate, and whose enemy was beyond conventional military calculation. The wildlings fought beside the Night's Watch. The northern soldiers fought beside both. For the first time in 8,000 years, the living stood together against the dead, and the living held. The fire trenches burned. The archers on the wall launched volleys of dragonglass-tipped arrows that shattered Whites on impact. The giant scythe, an ancient weapon built into the wall itself, swept the ice face clear of climbing dead. The battle raged for 2 days, day bleeding into night, and night into day, and the defenders held because there was nowhere to retreat, and nothing to retreat to. Jon fought on the wall's top during the first night. The dead climbed the ice with the mindless persistence of insects, their frozen fingers finding purchase in the cracks and seams that 8,000 years of weather had carved into the surface. The Night's Watch archers fired dragonglass arrows into the climbing mass, and each arrow that struck true sent a White tumbling back to the base in a shower of frozen limbs. But for every White that fell, 2 more took its place, and the mathematics of the defense were the mathematics of exhaustion, the living growing weaker while the dead remained constant. Jon's swordsmanship found a new dimension in the fighting atop the wall. The Whites did not fight with skill. They fought with numbers and cold and the unsettling wrongness of bodies that moved without the animating spark of life. Their joints bending at angles that living joints could not achieve. Their broken limbs continuing to grasp and claw even after the body they belonged to had been severed. Against such opponents, Jon's speed and precision were less important than his endurance and his ability to maintain clean technique over hours of continuous fighting. The artistry that had beaten Jaime Lannister was replaced by a brutal efficiency that prioritized survival over elegance, every stroke aimed at maximum damage with minimum energy expenditure. The giant ice scythe was released twice during the first night. Each time, the massive blade swept the wall face clean of climbing dead, sending hundreds of wights plummeting 700 feet to shatter on the frozen ground below. Each time, the silence that followed lasted only minutes before the next wave began to climb. The wildlings fought with a desperation that surpassed even the Night's Watch. They had seen what the dead did to the living. They had watched their villages burn and their families rise as wights. For them, this was not an abstract defense of a wall they had spent their lives trying to breach. This was the last stand of the living, the final battle between everything they were and everything the Night King wanted them to become. Tormund Giantsbane, the massive red-bearded wildling who had become something between an ally and a friend to Jon in the weeks since the crossing, fought at Jon's side on the wall with an axe in each hand and a continuous stream of profanity that served as both war cry and personal commentary on the quality of the opposition. The second day brought the White Walkers themselves to the base of the wall. The lesser creatures moved with a terrible grace, their ice armor reflecting the grey light in prismatic patterns, their weapons leaving trails of frost in the air. Where they walked, the temperature dropped so sharply that the defenders' breath crystallized and fell as ice dust. The archers who targeted them found that dragonglass arrows shattered the walkers on impact, but hitting a moving target from 700 feet above through driving snow was a feat that even the best bowmen could manage only rarely. Jon descended to the base of the wall as the second night began. The fighting below was more desperate than the fighting above. A close quarters battle in the shadow of the ice, where torchlight and firelight pushed back the supernatural cold, and the line between living and dead blurred in the darkness. He fought in the killing ground before the gate with Longclaw in his hand and Ghost at his side, and the Valyrian steel sang each time it struck a wight. A high clear note that cut through the sounds of battle like a bell through fog. On the second night, the Night King breached the wall's defenses. He came through the east tunnel with a guard of White Walkers, moving with the slow, deliberate purpose of a creature that had planned this assault for millennia and was in no particular hurry to complete it. The cold he brought with him was visible, a frost that raced along the tunnel walls and froze the torches in their brackets and turned the defenders' breath to ice before it left their mouths. Jon met him in the passage beneath the wall. It was not a duel in any recognizable sense. The Night King did not fight with technique or skill. He fought with the cold, patient power of something that had existed for millennia and that considered individual combat a curiosity rather than a contest. His movements were slow and devastating, each strike carrying the weight of winter itself, and the blade he wielded was made of ice that was harder than steel and colder than anything the living world could produce. Jon's speed counted for nothing against a creature that did not tire. His technique was irrelevant against an opponent whose body was ice and whose weapons were cold beyond anything steel could withstand. The greatest swordsman in Westeros, the man who had beaten Jaime Lannister and fought through the Red Wedding and carved his name into the history of every battlefield he had touched, was outmatched by something that was not alive and did not care about skill. The Night King's blade struck Jon's borrowed sword, and the steel shattered. The fragments scattered across the tunnel floor like broken teeth, and Jon stood in the freezing dark with no weapon and no defense against the creature that was walking toward him with the unhurried patience of death itself. But Jon had a Valyrian steel sword. Longclaw, the blade Lord Commander Mormont had given to the Watch, and that the temporary commander had pressed into Jon's hands when the dead came, because Valyrian steel was one of the only weapons that could kill a White Walker, and the best blade should be in the best hands. Longclaw hung at his hip. He had not drawn it first, because the tunnel was narrow, and the Valyrian blade was too precious to risk in the initial press. Now it was the only weapon he had. He drew Longclaw. The Valyrian steel hummed in the cold air, a sound that was felt rather than heard, as if the blade itself recognized the thing it faced. Jon hit the Night King once. The blow landed on the creature's shoulder, a strike that should have been impossible given the speed difference between them. But Jon did not hit with speed. He hit with the precise, economical movement of a swordsman who had learned to make every fraction of energy count, a strike that traveled the shortest distance between blade and target. The Valyrian steel did what normal steel could not. It cut. The Night King looked at the wound with an expression that might have been surprise if his face had been capable of human expression. Jon hit him again. And again. The third blow found the center of the Night King's chest, and the Valyrian steel drove through ice and cold and whatever served the creature for a heart, and the Night King shattered. The army of the dead fell. Every White Walker, every frozen corpse that had risen to serve the Night King collapsed like puppets with cut strings. The blizzard broke. The clouds tore apart and the stars appeared, and the silence that followed was the silence of a world that had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Jon stood at the base of the wall with Longclaw in his hand and Ghost beside him, and the bodies of the dead dissolving into mist around him. The greatest swordsman in Westeros had fought the greatest enemy the world had ever produced, and the victory tasted like exhaustion and loss, and the particular hollowness that followed when the thing you had been fighting for was finally done. He leaned against the wall and felt the ice against his back and the cold in his bones and the weight of everything he had done, and Ghost pressed against his leg and was warm. And the warmth was enough. They told him the truth the following spring. Robb came to the wall with Catelyn and Howland Reed, and they sat in the Lord Commander's quarters, which Jon had been using because no one else had claimed them, and Howland told the story of the Tower of Joy. He told it simply. The war, the tower, Lyanna dying, the baby, the promise. He told it without embellishment or apology, in the quiet voice of a man who had carried a secret for 17 years and was finally setting it down. Jon listened in silence. His face showed nothing. The same careful blankness he had learned to wear as a boy in Winterfell, when the world told him he did not belong. But behind the blankness, everything he had ever believed about himself was rearranging, and the process was neither quick nor quiet. He thought of every moment in his life that this truth recast, the morning in the solar when Ned had refused to let him take the black. The look in Ned's eyes, the almost speaking, the storm of pressure behind the silence. Ned had been looking at his sister's son and trying not to say the words that would have changed everything and endangered everything. The wall would have taken Jon, and the wall would have meant a lifetime of ignorance. A Targaryen prince freezing on the ice without ever knowing what he was. Catelyn's cruelty found its true shape. She had punished a child for a sin that had never been committed, hated a boy for a betrayal that had never occurred. Ned had been faithful. Every cold look, every excluded feast, every moment of Jon's childhood that had been colored by the knowledge that one person in his household wished him gone. All of it had been built on a foundation of misunderstanding so complete that it was almost elegant in its tragedy. And Ned, who had carried this secret for 17 years, who had let the world believe he had fathered a bastard, who had accepted his wife's pain and his own dishonor and the quiet judgment of every man who heard the story of Ned Stark's bastard boy, all to protect a baby he had promised his dying sister he would keep safe. The cost of that promise had been enormous. It had cost Ned his wife's trust, his reputation for absolute honor, and the relationship with his nephew that he could never fully claim. He had paid that price every day for 17 years, and he had never wavered, and he had never told, and he had died in King's Landing, with the secret still locked inside him. Jon's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table and willed the trembling to stop. And after a moment it did, because Jon Stark had spent his life learning to control what his body did, regardless of what his emotions wanted. Rhaegar Targaryen, Jon said. Your father, Howland said. Ned Stark. Your uncle, who raised you as his son to save your life. Jon looked at his hands. The hands of a swordsman, calloused and scarred. The hands that had held a blade since childhood and had never held anything else with the same certainty. the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, a prince by blood, a Stark by choice, a swordsman by necessity. Does this change anything? Jon asked. Robb leaned forward. It changes your claim. If the realm knew, you would have a stronger claim to the Iron Throne than anyone alive. I did not ask about claims. I asked whether it changes anything. Jon looked at his brother, his cousin, the person who had been both those things without either of them knowing it. I am Jon Stark. You made me that. The North made me that. A name from a dead prince does not undo what was built. You do not want the throne. I want to go home. The word landed in the room with a weight that surprised everyone, including Jon. Home, the thing he had spent his life looking for, the belonging that no amount of skill or fame or legitimization had been able to provide. And yet the word came out simply, without drama, without the ache that had always accompanied it before. Something had changed at the wall. Something had shifted in the long cold nights and the terrible battle and the silence that followed the Night King's fall. The boy who had swung a sword in anger because he did not belong had become a man who had fought for something larger than belonging, and in doing so, he had found it. Then come home, Robb said. Jon returned to Winterfell as the snows receded and the first hints of spring touched the land. The roads north were muddy with meltwater, and the fields on either side were brown and bare, but beneath the brown, the first green was appearing. The tentative, stubborn green of things that had survived the winter and intended to grow. The castle was as he remembered it, and different from what he remembered, because he was different, and the eyes that saw it now were not the eyes that had left it. He walked to the godswood on his first evening back. The heart tree stood as it had always stood, white and red and watching, its carved face wearing an expression that could mean anything or nothing. The hot springs steamed in the cool air. Ghosts settled at the base of the tree and watched the darkness with red eyes that seemed to know more than any animal should. Jon sat on the stone bench. He set his sword across his knees, the blade that had killed the Night King, the blade that had beaten Jaime Lannister, the blade that had carved a path through the Red Wedding and retaken Winterfell and held the wall against the army of the dead. The greatest sword in the greatest hands in Westeros. He was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen. He was the cousin of Robb Stark. He was the man who had defended the living against the dead. He was Jon Stark, legitimized, named, placed in the line of succession of a kingdom that he had helped rebuild from the wreckage of a war that had nearly destroyed it. And he was still, underneath all of it, the boy who had stood in the yard at Winterfell and swung a sword because it was the only thing in the world that belonged entirely to him. The snow began to fall. Light, sparse. The first snow of a spring that would be brief before the next winter came. It settled on his cloak and on the weirwood leaves and on Ghost's white fur, where it was invisible, and on the dark steel of the sword, where it melted on contact. The godswood was quiet. The castle was warm behind him, voices and firelight, and the sounds of a family putting itself back together. Robb and Catelyn and Arya, who had returned from her own journey with stories she would not tell and skills she would not explain. Sansa, who had survived King's Landing and the Vale, and emerged harder and wiser, and still capable of kindness when kindness was warranted. Bran, who had come back from beyond the wall with knowledge that frightened everyone, including himself. Rickon, who had grown wild and loud and was slowly, cautiously learning to trust the walls around him again. Jon sat in the godswood with his sword on his knees and the snow falling and Ghost beside him, and the silence was not empty. It was full. Full of everything he had done and everything he had survived and everything he had become. And the distance between the bastard boy who had swung a sword in anger and the man who set it down in peace was the distance of a life that had been worth living. The snow fell. The heart tree watched. And Jon Stark sat beneath the weirwood and let the silence carry him, because the silence was enough, and it always had been.